5 years ago, I received the worst phone call a father could ever get. My only daughter was in a catastrophic accident. For 60 months, I faithfully sent her husband $1,000 to keep her in a specialized, isolated care facility. But yesterday, an old family friend called me. She said she just saw my comatose daughter trying on silk dresses at a high-end mall. I am Morgan. I am 69 years old. I am a retired structural engineer. My entire career was built on calculating load-bearing limits and identifying fatal flaws in foundations. But the biggest flaw I ever missed was the man my daughter married. Before I tell you how I systematically dismantled his entire life piece by piece, let me know what city you are listening from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect your family from a predator disguised as a loved one. The blue light of my laptop illuminated my dark study. I clicked the confirmation button on my banking application. The screen flashed a green checkmark. Transfer successful. $1,000 sent directly to Wyatt. It was the 60th time I made that exact transaction. Exactly $60,000 from my hard-earned retirement savings sent to my white son-in-law to pay for my daughter's specialized medical care. I closed the laptop, feeling the familiar heavy ache in my chest. Then my cell phone rang. The caller ID showed Brenda. She was Camille's old college roommate. We had not spoken in a few years. I swiped to answer, expecting a brief, polite check-in or offering of condolences. Instead, her voice came through the speaker, rushed and completely breathless. "Morgan, you need to listen to me carefully. I'm at the Pacific Place Mall in Seattle. I just saw Camille." I froze completely. The phone felt suddenly heavy in my hand like a block of lead. I told Brenda she must be mistaken. I reminded her calmly that Camille was in a long-term neurological rehabilitation center in upstate New York. I told her my daughter could not walk or talk, let alone go shopping on the other side of the country. Brenda let out a frustrated, heavy sigh. She insisted it was Camille. She said Camille was looking at expensive designer dresses and laughing brightly with a little boy. I felt a sudden, sharp spike of anger. I asked Brenda if this was some kind of sick joke. My daughter suffered a traumatic brain injury 5 years ago. My son-in-law Wyatt visits her every week because the facility strictly restricts external visitors to prevent severe neurological overstimulation. I recited the exact medical lies Wyatt had fed me for half a decade. Brenda did not back down at all. She told me she manages a luxury boutique on the second floor of that shopping center. She said she recognized Camille's loud, distinctive laugh before she even saw her face. She walked right past the store window holding shopping bags. I gripped the thick wooden edge of my desk. My breathing grew shallow and tight. A structural engineer does not rely on feelings or hearsay. We rely on concrete data and visible proof. I told Brenda I needed absolute, undeniable proof. I could not accuse my grieving son-in-law or upend my own mourning process over a simple case of mistaken identity. Brenda paused for a moment. Then she told me her store has high-definition security cameras pointing directly at the public promenade. She promised to go to the back office immediately, pull the footage from 10 minutes ago and send it directly to my phone. I hung up the device. The silence in my study was completely deafening. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I stared at the blank screen of my phone, just waiting. Minutes stretched into hours. My analytical mind raced, trying to rationalize the impossible situation. Wyatt was a supposedly successful tech entrepreneur. He was an arrogant man who often complained about how my African-American working-class roots made him look bad at his country club dinners. But he had always played the part of the devoted, grieving husband perfectly. He sent me monthly written medical updates. He cried on the phone with me on her birthdays. The phone chimed loudly. A video file arrived from Brenda. I opened it with a trembling thumb. The video was crystal clear and undeniable. It showed the bright promenade outside Brenda's boutique. A woman walked right through the center of the frame. She was wearing a stylish tan trench coat. Her hair was perfectly styled and glossy. She was holding the hand of a toddler. She turned her head to look at a display window and smiled warmly. It was Camille. My Camille. She was not in a wheelchair. She was not hooked up to feeding tubes or monitors. She looked healthier and more vibrant than the day she married Wyatt. The digital image burned deeply into my retinas. I sat back heavily in my worn leather chair. My mind was violently thrown back to a rainy Tuesday night 5 years ago. I remembered the frantic ringing of the phone at 3 in the morning. Wyatt was on the other end, sobbing hysterically into the receiver. He told me they had been in a horrible car crash on the wet interstate. He said he walked away with minor bruises, but Camille took the brutal brunt of the impact. He told me she was in a medically induced coma with severe brain swelling. I packed a travel bag immediately ready to fly to their city. But Wyatt forcefully stopped me. He told me the doctors were transferring her to a highly experimental restricted access neurological center. He claimed the specialists insisted on absolute zero stimulation. No visitors were allowed. No familiar voices could be heard. No emotional triggers could be present. He said seeing me might cause a fatal spike in her intracranial pressure. I was a man of science and logic. I respected medical authority blindly. I stayed away because I wanted my only daughter to live. Wyatt became my absolute only bridge to my child. He would call me weeping late at night, detailing her slow, agonizing lack of progress. He told me his startup company was failing because he spent all his time managing her complex care. He said the experimental treatments were draining their entire life savings. Without a single hesitation, I offered to send him $1,000 every single month from my engineering pension to cover the out-of-pocket costs. I wore my old clothes until the cuffs frayed. I stopped taking my annual fishing trips. I ate cheap meals at home. I sacrificed my comfortable golden years gladly because I thought I was keeping my little girl alive and breathing. Wyatt took my money with profound declarations of tearful gratitude. He praised me for being a supportive, reliable father. He used my blind love as a weapon to empty my bank accounts while treating me like an annoying nuisance whenever I asked too many specific medical questions. I looked at the video on my phone again. The woman walking in the video was not a brain damage victim recovering from a coma. She was living a life of absolute luxury and ease, and the toddler holding her hand looked to be about 3 years old. My daughter was supposedly in a deep coma for 5 years. How could she possibly have a 3-year-old child walking beside her? A cold, calculating, and mechanical rage replaced the initial shock in my chest. I opened my bottom desk drawer and pulled out the thick file where I kept all of Camille forwarded medical information. I found the glossy brochure for the exclusive neurological facility Wyatt had given me years ago. I had never called them directly because Wyatt convinced me the administrators would penalize him for family interference and potentially discharge her. I picked up my phone and dialed the main facility number. A professional receptionist answered immediately. I asked to speak to the facility director regarding a long-term patient named Camille. I used my most authoritative, commanding voice. The director got on the line a few moments later, sounding slightly confused. I explained I was her biological father and I needed to verify her current residency status for urgent insurance purposes. I heard the rapid clicking of a computer keyboard on the other end of the line. The director paused for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then he delivered the final crushing blow to the world I thought I knew. He told me there was a massive misunderstanding. He said Camille was indeed admitted to their facility 5 years ago for mild concussion observation after a minor traffic collision, but she was fully discharged exactly 4.5 years ago. He read the official medical notes out loud to me. She walked out of this building on her own 2 feet, completely recovered and entirely healthy. I thanked the director politely and hung up the phone. I did not scream in anger. I did not break anything in my office. I sat in the darkness and let the crushing reality wash over me completely. Wyatt had faked my daughter's coma for 5 years to systematically steal $60,000 from my retirement funds. The silent adjustment had officially begun. I did not throw my phone. I did not smash the framed photographs on my desk. A good engineer knows that an emotional reaction solves absolutely nothing. You do not yell at a collapsing bridge. You calculate the exact point of structural failure, and you plan the demolition carefully. I walked into my bedroom and pulled my old leather duffel bag from the top shelf of the closet. I packed exactly 4 shirts, 3 pairs of trousers, and my shaving kit. Then I went back to my study and opened the bottom drawer of my desk. I took out my original engineering notebook. Its thick grid paper had mapped out the stress limits of commercial skyscrapers and suspension bridges across the country. Now it would serve a new purpose. It would become the official ledger for dismantling Wyatt's entire existence. I opened my laptop and navigated to an airline website. I typed in Seattle as my destination. I booked the first available one-way ticket departing in 3 hours. I paid extra for a premium seat because my days of sacrificing my comfort for that parasite were officially over. I did not call Wyatt to demand an explanation. I did not text him an angry threat. I gave him the absolute worst weapon possible. Total silence. Let him think his carefully constructed lie was still holding weight. I zipped my bag shut, grabbed my heavy oak walking cane, and walked out of my empty house. The silence was not peaceful. It was the sound of an impending storm. I hailed a cab to the airport. I sat in the back seat watching the Texas highway roll past the rain-streaked window. My phone vibrated violently against my leg. The screen lit up with Wyatt's name. The timing was almost poetic. I stared at the flashing screen for 3 full rings. I took a deep, controlled breath, lowering my heart rate. Then I swiped to answer. I placed the phone to my ear and delivered a perfectly flat greeting. Wyatt's voice came through the speaker, thick with manufactured grief and rehearsed exhaustion. "Morgan, I am so glad you answered," he said, his voice cracking with artificial emotion. "I am sitting in the hospital parking lot right now. It was a bad night, Morgan, a really bad night." I asked him what happened, keeping my tone completely level. Wyatt let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. He told me Camille had suffered a sudden spike in intracranial pressure. He claimed the specialists had to sedate her heavily to prevent seizures. Then came the hook. He said the lead neurologist had proposed a highly experimental localized surgery to relieve the pressure permanently. He called it a breakthrough procedure. But then his voice dropped into a shameful whisper. He said his insurance would not cover the experimental nature of the surgery. He told me the out-of-pocket cost was exactly $15,000 up front. He started crying softly into the receiver, apologizing for being a failure of a husband and begging for my help to save my little girl. The sheer audacity of his performance was breathtaking. He was standing on the throat of my dead wife's memory, extorting an old man for a phantom surgery on a perfectly healthy woman. A lesser man would have screamed. I would have called him a liar and a thief. But I am an engineer. I know that if you want to catch a rat, you do not break the trap. You add more cheese. I kept my voice incredibly soft and incredibly steady. I told Wyatt not to worry about the money. I told him he was a good son-in-law and a devoted husband. I promised him I would liquidate some emergency bonds first thing next week and wire the entire $15,000 directly to his account. I heard the instant relief wash over his voice. He thanked me profusely, calling me his guardian angel. I told him to stay strong and hung up the phone. I looked at the dark screen and smiled a completely joyless smile. The rat was comfortably in the cage. He thought he was about to get a massive payday. He had no idea he was actually financing his own absolute destruction. Sitting in the quiet hum of the airplane cabin 30,000 feet above the ground, I had plenty of time to reflect on the nature of the man who had stolen half a decade of my life. Wyatt was a textbook example of unearned arrogance. He was a white tech entrepreneur who wore expensive tailored suits and spoke in corporate buzzwords that meant absolutely nothing. From the moment Camille first brought him home, I sensed a deep, insidious superiority complex radiating from him. He always looked at my calloused, scarred hands with a subtle, barely disguised disdain. He made passive-aggressive comments about my modest brick house in a predominantly black working-class neighborhood. He loved to casually mention his exclusive country club memberships and his elite networking events as if to remind me of the societal gap between us. He wanted everyone to know he belonged to a different higher world. But the bitter, profound irony was that his shiny, elite world was built entirely on a foundation of lies and my hard-earned money. He looked down on my heritage and my 4 decades of physical labor, but he had absolutely no problem quietly siphoning my pension to fund his luxurious lifestyle. Every single glass of aged scotch he drank at those country club dinners was paid for by the hot meals I skipped. Every designer suit he wore was financed by the fraying cuffs of my old shirts. He thought I was just a simple, aging black man who could be easily manipulated with a few complex medical terms and some fake tears. He completely mistook my quiet humility for sheer stupidity. He assumed that because I did not talk loudly or boast about my finances, I lacked the intelligence to see through his game. But Wyatt did not understand the first fundamental rule of structural engineering. The quietest foundations are the ones that hold the absolute most weight. He had built his entire scam on the arrogant assumption that I would never verify his claims. He built a towering skyscraper of deceit on a foundation of pure, blind hubris. And as I watched the dark clouds part outside the airplane window, I knew exactly where to place the explosive charges to bring his entire fraudulent existence crashing down into absolute dust. I landed in Seattle just as the evening rain began to fall. The cold Pacific Northwest drizzle matched the icy determination settling deep in my bones. I rented a car and drove directly to the address Brenda had provided me. It was an upscale gated neighborhood lined with tall evergreens and expensive foreign cars parked in immaculate driveways. I parked a few houses down and walked through the heavy rain, relying on my heavy oak walking cane to steady my steps. I stood in the dark shadow of a large oak tree, staring at the expansive, warmly lit living room window of the house. I did not care that the rain was soaking through my coat. I kept my eyes fixed on the glass. Suddenly, a figure walked into the bright room. It was Camille. My breath hitched in my throat. She was not hooked to any machines. She was not a hollow shell lying in a hospital bed. She was moving with absolute vibrant energy, pouring a glass of water in a modern kitchen. But then the ultimate reality-shattering shock hit me. Camille leaned down and scooped up a child from the floor. He was a little boy with curly hair and bright eyes. He looked to be exactly 3 years old. He was my grandson. My daughter had supposedly been in a deep vegetative coma for 5 years. The impossible truth slammed into my chest. I stepped out of the dark shadows of the neighborhood and walked directly up the driveway. The cold Seattle rain beat down heavily on my shoulders, but I did not feel the chill. I raised my fist and knocked on the heavy wooden front door with 3 loud, deliberate strikes. A moment later, the deadbolt clicked loudly. The door swung inward. Camille stood there. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second in pure, absolute shock. Then that shock morphed instantly into a hard, bitter hatred. Her face tightened into a rigid mask of absolute resentment. She did not reach out to hug me. She did not cry tears of joy at seeing her father after 5 long years of separation. She looked at me as if I were a toxic, dangerous stranger invading her private sanctuary. She told me I had a lot of nerve showing up at her house after everything I had done to her. She said she had absolutely nothing to say to me and told me to leave her property immediately. She grabbed the heavy edge of the door and shoved it forward, attempting to slam it right in my face. The sheer hostility radiating from my own daughter was like a physical blow to my chest. It made absolutely no logical sense. I had spent half a decade funding her survival and mourning her supposed coma. But the look in her dark eyes was not confusion. It was pure, unadulterated anger. I did not step back. As she pushed the door shut, I thrust my heavy oak walking cane directly into the door jamb. The solid wood cracked against the frame, stopping the door instantly in its tracks. Camille gasped and tried to push harder, but I leveraged my entire body weight against the thick cane. I spent 40 years hauling steel beams and inspecting concrete foundations. An aging structural engineer still retains a formidable amount of physical strength. I pushed the door wide open and stepped firmly into the hallway. The little boy I had seen through the window was sitting on the living room rug playing quietly with a toy truck. He looked up at me with curious, bright eyes. Camille immediately stepped between me and the child, acting like a fiercely protective human shield. She held a glass of water in her trembling right hand and pointed her left finger directly at my chest. She demanded to know why I was breaking into her home after abandoning her to drown in massive medical debt. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with her unfounded accusations. I reached into the inside pocket of my damp trench coat. I pulled out a thick bound stack of official papers. It was a complete dossier of exactly 60 printed bank wire transfer receipts. I walked right past her and slammed the entire stack down onto the marble kitchen island. The heavy thud echoed loudly through the quiet house. I told her to look at the papers before she said another single word to me. Camille stared at the stack of documents cautiously. She slowly walked over to the kitchen island, keeping herself positioned carefully between me and her young son. She picked up the top piece of paper. Her eyes scanned the printed text. Then she flipped to the next page, and the next. Her eyes darted rapidly across the official dates, the routing numbers, and the transfer amounts. $1,000. Sent on the 1st of every single month. For exactly 5 years, sent directly into Wyatt's primary checking account. I watched the color completely drain from her face. Her breathing hitched in her throat. Her hand began to shake violently. The glass of water slipped from her frozen grip. It hit the hardwood floor and shattered into 100 jagged pieces. The loud, sharp crash made the little boy jump, but neither Camille nor I broke eye contact. The cold water pooled around her shoes, but she did not move an inch. She just stared at the banking papers as if they were written in an alien language. She whispered my name, sounding exactly like a lost, terrified child. She asked me what these financial papers meant. I looked closely at my daughter for the first time in 5 years. Beneath her stylish clothing and her perfectly arranged hair, I saw the deep, profound exhaustion etched into her features. There were heavy dark circles under her eyes. Her posture carried the massive invisible weight of relentless stress. She looked like a woman who had been running a brutal marathon with no finish line in sight. Slowly, the harsh reality of her isolated life in Seattle began to spill out of her trembling lips. She told me she had been practically raising her son entirely alone. Wyatt was almost never home. He frequently traveled across the country claiming he was attending vital networking events and pursuing venture capital funding. He told her his tech startup was struggling under the immense weight of the astronomical medical bills from her car accident. He made her believe they were constantly teetering on the absolute edge of total financial ruin. He strictly managed all their household finances, giving her a meager controlled allowance for groceries and basic necessities, while he supposedly paid off the crippling debts he claimed they owed to the hospital. He told her she needed to stay home and focus entirely on her health and raising their son, while he carried the massive financial burden of their family alone. She lived in a state of constant paralyzing anxiety, terrified that the bank would foreclose on their home at any given moment. She sacrificed her own career aspirations and isolated herself from her old friends out of deep financial shame. She accepted his constant prolonged absences and his controlling financial behavior because she genuinely believed she owed him her life. She thought her medical recovery had single-handedly ruined his entrepreneurial dreams. Wyatt had systematically cut her off from anyone who might question his heroic narrative. He convinced her that the stress of outside relationships would trigger severe neurological relapses. He kept her permanently trapped in a beautiful gilded cage of guilt and endless gratitude. She was essentially a single mother bearing the crushing weight of a completely manufactured financial crisis while he lived a separate life. I pointed at the thick stack of bank transfers and told her I had funded her supposed medical care for 5 years because Wyatt told me she was locked in a deep vegetative coma. Camille covered her mouth with both of her hands. Hot tears streamed down her face as the ultimate sinister truth finally snapped into place. She choked out a heavy sob and revealed the devastating psychological lie Wyatt had carefully planted in her mind. Wyatt had told Camille that I was deeply ashamed of her car accident and her injuries. He claimed I had completely disowned her because I disapproved of her life choices and abhorred the fact that she was having a mixed-race child. He told her I had callously refused to pay a single dime toward her medical recovery and explicitly demanded that they never contact me again. Wyatt purposefully intercepted all my letters. He blocked my phone number on her personal devices. He built an impenetrable massive wall of deceit between a loving father and his only daughter. We stood in the kitchen looking at each other through the shattered remnants of a 5-year illusion. I realized the profound, terrifying depth of his depravity. Wyatt had not just stolen my retirement money. He had stolen my daughter. He had stolen the first 3 years of my grandson's life. He pitted us against each other to ensure we would never compare our stories. We were both victims of a highly calculated parasitic monster who fed on our mutual pain. The tears in my daughter's eyes were the final catalyst I needed. I did not pull her into a desperate, sobbing embrace. That emotional release would have to wait. Right now, we were standing in the wreckage of a collapsed building and we needed to urgently assess the structural damage. I pulled a heavy wooden chair from the dining table and instructed Camille to sit down. I grabbed a towel and quickly wiped up the spilled water and the shattered glass from the floor. I told her to bring me her personal laptop immediately. The overwhelming grief that had choked the room moments ago evaporated completely. It was instantly replaced by a cold, highly calculated mechanical fury. I am an engineer. When a physical structure fails, you do not weep over the broken concrete. You analyze the stress points and you dig directly into the original blueprints. Wyatt had built a massive financial fortress entirely out of thin air and profound deceit. Now it was time to rip out the foundational pillars and watch him fall. Camille retrieved a sleek silver laptop from her home office and placed it on the kitchen island right next to my stack of wire transfer receipts. She opened the screen and her hands hovered nervously over the keyboard. She told me Wyatt handled all their passwords. She said he locked her out of their joint accounts, claiming the intense stress of managing their massive medical debt would trigger her severe migraines. I pulled the computer toward me. I told her we were not going to look at his accounts. We were going to rip open hers. I instructed Camille to navigate to the primary banking portal for her old personal checking and savings accounts. She hesitated, telling me she had not logged into her personal portal in almost 5 years. Wyatt had convinced her it was safer to merge everything into a unified family trust, which he strictly managed. He told her the old accounts were dormant and practically empty. I cracked my knuckles and began the digital recovery process. Security protocols are just logical gates. They rely on human memory and predictable patterns. I walked her through the password recovery steps. When the banking system prompted her for two-factor authentication, Wyatt had naturally routed the security codes to his own cell phone number. I bypassed the phone verification by selecting the security question alternative. Wyatt was a master manipulator, but he was profoundly lazy when it came to digital architecture. He had left her original security questions completely intact. What is the name of your first pet? What street did you grow up on? Camille typed in the answers with shaking fingers. We bypassed the secondary firewall by answering questions only a father and a daughter would know. The screen buffered. A loading circle spun endlessly in the center of the bright display. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. We could only hear the soft breathing of my grandson playing quietly on the rug behind us. I watched the progress bar inch forward. I felt the familiar sharp adrenaline rush of inspecting a compromised support beam. We were about to shine a massive floodlight into the dark cavern where Wyatt had been hiding his sins. The system finally asked for a password reset. I told Camille to type in a phrase Wyatt would never guess. She typed it in and hit the enter key. The banking portal unlocked. The dashboard loaded completely, revealing a full financial history that had been buried under thick layers of domestic gaslighting. I clicked on the main account history and requested a detailed statement stretching back exactly 60 months to the precise date of her terrible car accident. While the massive digital file generated, Camille stared blankly at the glowing screen. Her voice dropped to a hollow, haunted whisper as she recalled the absolute darkest period of her life. She told me the truth about the accident. She was not in a coma for 5 years. She was in a medically induced coma for exactly 6 months. When she finally woke up, she was severely disoriented, heavily medicated, and terrified. She was strapped to a hospital bed with monitors beeping relentlessly around her. Wyatt was sitting right beside her, holding her hand and weeping profusely. He painted a terrifying picture of her physical condition. He told her she had suffered catastrophic brain damage. He said the doctors warned him she might never fully regain her cognitive functions or walk again. In her highly vulnerable and drugged state, she believed every single word he said. A few days after she woke up, Wyatt brought a public notary directly into her private hospital room. He presented her with a thick stack of complex legal documents. He held the pen in her weak, trembling hand. He told her the hospital administration required an emergency medical power of attorney to authorize life-saving treatments and experimental therapies. He cried softly, telling her he needed the legal authority to protect her and keep her alive. Camille trusted her husband completely. She signed the papers blindly through a thick haze of heavy painkillers and sheer physical exhaustion. She did not read the fine print. She did not realize she was not signing a medical directive. Wyatt had completely fabricated the administrative emergency to execute a masterclass in financial exploitation. He had presented her with a comprehensive, durable power of attorney. That single signature gave him absolute, unrestricted legal control over her entire life. He gained the power to manage her assets, sell her properties, and access her personal wealth without ever needing her explicit consent again. He trapped her in a binding legal prison while she was physically unable to defend herself. A loud chime from the laptop interrupted her devastating story. The 5-year transaction history finished downloading. I opened the digital file and scrolled directly to the summary page. My eyes immediately locked onto the total balance section. Camille let out a sharp, strangled gasp. Before she met Wyatt, Camille had a private trust fund left to her by her late mother. It was designed to secure her future and protect her independence. The original balance was well over $400,000. The current balance displayed on the screen was exactly zero. I scrolled down, analyzing the transaction logs with surgical precision. Wyatt had not just drained the account. He had systematically stripped it bare through massive regular transfers spanning the first 2 years of her physical recovery. He had liquidated her entire maternal inheritance while she was trapped in her own home, believing they were destitute. He had even secretly mortgaged the small house they previously owned. I traced the outgoing routing numbers to their final destination. Every single dollar of my daughter's trust fund, along with the $60,000 I had personally sent him, was funneled into a single corporate account. It was a registered shell company. The beneficiary name printed in cold black ink across the screen was Camille's Hope Foundation. Wyatt had stolen nearly $500,000 to fund a fake charity in his living victim's name. I stared at the flashing cursor on the laptop screen. The name of the fake charity mocked us in bold black letters. Camille was trembling beside me, her entire reality shattered into a million jagged pieces. I put my heavy hand on her shaking shoulder and told her to breathe slowly. We had the digital proof, but raw data is not enough to put a predator behind bars. A piece of paper means absolutely nothing without the brutal legal force to execute it properly. I told Camille to pack a small overnight bag for her and my young grandson. She was not staying in that compromised house for another single night. I moved them immediately into a highly secure hotel downtown under a completely different name. I strictly instructed her not to answer any calls from Wyatt and to leave her tracking-enabled devices powered down and locked in the trunk of my rental car. Once I knew my blood was safe and hidden, I packed my leather duffel bag again. I needed heavy artillery. I needed weapons forged in ruthless courtrooms and corporate boardrooms. I could not fight a financial parasite with my bare hands. I drove straight to the Seattle airport and booked the first available flight back to Texas. Wyatt thought he was playing a long game of emotional chess with a grieving old man. He did not realize I was changing the entire battlefield. I was going back to my home turf to mobilize a powerful network I had spent 40 years building. It was time to hunt. The exact moment my boots hit the Texas pavement, I made two very specific and highly confidential phone calls. The first call was to Maxwell Reed. Maxwell was a ruthless corporate financial attorney who operated at the highest levels of the state legal system. He wore $3,000 tailored suits and had a terrifying reputation for dismantling corrupt corporate executives with the cold, unfeeling efficiency of a surgical scalpel. We had met 2 decades ago when he desperately needed a master structural engineer to prove a massive commercial construction fraud case. I provided the undeniable mathematical load data that won him a $50 million settlement in federal court. He owed me a massive personal favor, and Maxwell was a man who always paid his debts. I walked directly into his downtown Dallas corner office and dropped the printed bank statements directly onto his polished mahogany desk. I told him my son-in-law had systematically stolen $500,000 and set up a fraudulent shell charity using my daughter's medical trauma as a shield. Maxwell barely blinked at the staggering sum. He simply pulled out a yellow legal pad and began drafting aggressive subpoenas and asset freeze requests with a predatory enthusiasm. The second call was to Jackson. Jackson was a highly specialized private investigator who operated entirely in the digital and physical shadows. He was a former military intelligence officer who specialized in finding hidden money and tracking people who desperately wanted to stay completely invisible. I met Jackson at a quiet, dimly lit diner on the industrial outskirts of the city. I slid a clear photograph of Wyatt across the sticky table along with his phone number and his supposedly registered corporate business addresses. I told Jackson I wanted every single microscopic detail of Wyatt's life ripped wide open for my viewing. I wanted his real-time geolocation data, his travel logs, his offshore credit card expenditures, and his hidden real estate holdings. I wanted to know where he slept, what he ate, and exactly who he spoke to on burner phones. Jackson pocketed the thick envelope of cash and promised me a comprehensive, unredacted dossier within 48 hours. Between Maxwell's aggressive legal maneuvering and Jackson's vast surveillance network, we wove a massive invisible digital spiderweb right over Wyatt's entire existence. We tracked the complex routing numbers flowing out of the fake charity. We monitored the international outgoing wire transfers. We mapped his daily driving routines. Wyatt was freely swimming through his life, completely unaware that the water around him was rapidly draining. We were not just building a standard legal case. We were meticulously constructing a financial Iron Maiden. Sitting alone in my quiet study waiting for Jackson's intelligence report, I fell naturally back into my oldest professional habits. I cleared my workspace, spread large sheets of grid paper across my drafting desk, and began mapping out Wyatt's entire operational timeline. As a structural engineer, I spent my entire adult life analyzing exactly how massive complex things fall apart. Most ordinary people look at a towering skyscraper and see an immovable permanent monolith. They think destroying something that big requires brute physical force or a massive swinging wrecking ball. But that is the flawed mindset of an absolute amateur. A true master engineer knows that you never waste your valuable energy swinging a hammer at reinforced steel and concrete. You study the foundational blueprints quietly. You look for the specific load-bearing columns that support the absolute most weight in the building. You find the exact microscopic fracture in the primary steel joint. If you remove the right structural pin at the exact right moment, gravity will do all the violent destructive work for you. The entire massive building will collapse in on itself, completely crushed by its own immense weight. Wyatt was exactly like a poorly designed commercial building. He had constructed an incredibly flashy, expensive exterior. He wore the right designer clothes, used the right corporate vocabulary, and projected an aura of complete upper-class white superiority to intimidate everyone around him. But his personal foundation was built entirely on shifting sand and stolen family money. He was inherently arrogant and deeply intellectually lazy. He relied heavily on the absolute silence and submission of his chosen victims. He thought my advancing age and my race meant I was inherently passive and easily managed. He assumed Camille was too broken, too scared, and too heavily medicated to ever question his absolute authority. He thought he had completely isolated the load-bearing pillars of his massive scam. He was fatally wrong. I was not going to confront him with angry emotional shouts or physical violence. That amateur move would only allow him to play the victim and call the local authorities. Instead, I was mapping the exact flow of his stolen money. I was identifying the specific legal and financial pins that held his luxurious fake life together. When the optimal time was right, I was going to pull those specific pins out simultaneously. I was going to let his own massive greed and endless lies crush him into absolute, unrecognizable dust. At exactly 2 a.m, my secure phone buzzed sharply on the glass table. It was an encrypted high-priority message from Jackson. He did not send a simple text update. He sent a high-resolution drone photograph and a detailed county real estate deed. I opened the digital file and my blood turned to absolute solid ice. The photograph showed a sprawling multi-million-dollar stone mansion located in a highly exclusive gated community in Austin, Texas. It was only 3 hours away from my own front door. Wyatt was not flying across the country pitching his startup to elite venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. He was living right here in my state. I zoomed in tightly on the expansive patio of the massive estate. Wyatt was sitting at a luxurious outdoor dining table laughing brightly. But he was not alone. Sitting right next to him was a blonde white woman wearing highly expensive diamond jewelry. Jackson's attached dossier identified her as Sylvia. They were actively toasting with crystal champagne flutes. Playing happily in the manicured custom pool behind them were 2 older teenage children. Wyatt was not a struggling entrepreneur sacrificing his life for his brain-damaged wife. He had an entirely separate, fully funded family. He had a whole other legal wife and teenage kids living in absolute supreme luxury. Camille was never his primary family. My daughter and my grandson were just his secret physical hostages. They were nothing but the captive cash cows actively funding his lavish Texas royalty lifestyle. The total demolition was now fully authorized. The doorbell chimed loudly through the quiet hallway of my brick house in Texas. I checked the security camera monitor glowing softly on my desk. Wyatt was standing on my front porch. He was wearing a slightly wrinkled navy suit with his tie pulled loose. He had carefully styled his blonde hair to look messy and frantic. He was putting on his absolute best performance of the exhausted, grieving husband who had just flown across the country to save his dying wife. I knew for a literal fact he had only driven 3 hours up the highway from his multi-million-dollar stone mansion in Austin. He had probably kissed his other wife Sylvia goodbye just a few hours ago after a luxurious breakfast. I took a deep, cleansing breath. I smoothed out the front of my shirt, grabbed my heavy oak walking cane, and walked slowly to the front door. I opened the heavy wooden door and put on the exact face he expected to see. I hunched my shoulders slightly and made my eyes look tired and defeated. I looked exactly like a grieving, aging black man who was entirely dependent on his white son-in-law for any connection to his only child. Wyatt immediately stepped forward and threw his arms around my shoulders in a firm, desperate hug. He smelled of expensive cedar cologne and premium espresso. He stepped into my living room and began pacing back and forth across the vintage rug, rubbing his face vigorously with both hands. He let out a loud, ragged sigh designed to convey immense, tragic pressure. I told him to sit down and offered to brew him a fresh cup of dark roast coffee. He collapsed onto the sofa, nodding gratefully. As I turned my back to him and walked into the kitchen, I reached under the edge of the granite kitchen island. I pressed the small red record button on a high-fidelity digital audio recorder I had securely taped there earlier that morning. It was capturing every single sound in the open-concept living space. I poured 2 cups of hot coffee and carried them back into the living room, placing them on the glass coffee table. Wyatt took a mug with shaking hands. He launched directly into his heavily rehearsed script. He told me the specialized neurosurgeons in Seattle were completely ready to perform the breakthrough procedure on Camille. He claimed the pressure in her brain was reaching a critical fatal threshold and time was running out rapidly. He squeezed his eyes shut hard and let a single perfect tear roll down his cheek. He told me he hated asking me for financial help, but he had completely exhausted his tech startup capital paying for her prior treatments. He begged me for the $15,000, telling me it was the absolute only way to bring my daughter back to me. He promised he would pay me back every single dime as soon as his company secured its next round of venture funding. I sat silently in my worn leather armchair. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. I did not show an ounce of the lethal radioactive rage boiling in my veins. I simply nodded sympathetically, encouraging him to keep talking and keep recording his own explicit financial extortion. Watching Wyatt perform his desperate weeping routine, I mentally reviewed the extensive background check Jackson had delivered to my secure server. Wyatt was not just an opportunistic thief who took advantage of a tragic car accident to steal my pension. He was a highly calculated, seasoned financial predator. His entire life history was a dark, miserable trail of systematic financial abuse targeting the elderly and the vulnerable. Jackson's dossier revealed that 12 years ago, Wyatt had completely bankrupted his own elderly great-aunt. He had used his polished, polite demeanor and his crisp suits to convince her he was an Ivy League financial genius. He talked her into granting him full legal control of her modest estate and drained every single penny to fund his first failed business venture. She died in a state-run nursing home completely destitute while he bought his first sports car. He specifically targeted my daughter Camille because he discovered she possessed a highly lucrative maternal trust fund and a father with a substantial unencumbered engineering pension. He used his practiced corporate vocabulary and his inherent societal privilege to project an aura of absolute trustworthiness. He knew exactly how to weaponize empathy against good people. He manipulated older people by making them feel included and respected before he systematically isolated them from their support networks and bled their accounts completely dry. He sat in my living room completely confident that his racial and socioeconomic presentation made him inherently unquestionable to a retired blue-collar worker. He thought I was just another gullible mark in his long career of successful scams. He assumed my age made me technologically illiterate and easily confused by complex medical jargon. He had absolutely no idea that he was currently sitting across from a man who spent 40 years detecting microscopic structural flaws in high-stress commercial environments. His performance was flawless to the untrained eye. He hit all the right emotional notes and displayed the perfect amount of vulnerability. But to a master engineer, his structural integrity was completely rotten. I could see the massive gaping cracks in his foundation right through his tailored suit. Wyatt wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and reached into his sleek leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick, stapled stack of legal documents and laid them carefully on the glass coffee table between us. He told me the hospital administration in Washington needed my signature as the biological father to authorize the highly experimental surgical procedure since he was technically an interested financial party. He handed me a heavy silver pen and pointed to the small yellow sticky note marking the final page. He told me to just sign at the bottom so he could fax it back to the surgical team immediately. I picked up the stack of papers and slowly adjusted my reading glasses. I took my absolute time. Wyatt tapped his expensive leather shoe nervously against the floor, urging me to hurry to save my daughter's life. I scanned the first few pages. They were filled with dense, complex medical jargon, standard hospital liability waivers, and intimidating surgical risk disclosures. But my eyes are professionally trained to catch millimeter discrepancies in 1,000-page architectural blueprints. I immediately noticed the paper stock on the very last page was marginally thicker than the rest of the packet. The font kerning was slightly different, and the ink was a fraction of a shade darker. I ignored the sticky note and read the dense legal text right above the signature line. It was not a medical authorization form at all. Wyatt had seamlessly slipped a comprehensive financial power of attorney and a full transfer on death real estate deed into the medical packet. The document explicitly granted Wyatt absolute legal control over my entire estate, my bank accounts, and my physical home in the event of my death or cognitive incapacitation. He was not just trying to steal $15,000 today. He was actively trying to steal my entire house, my retirement accounts, and my absolute total net worth with a single stroke of a pen. I stared at the thick black line at the bottom of the page. The trap was perfectly laid out right in front of me. Wyatt was watching me with absolute hawkish intensity disguised as deep familial concern. If I refused to sign this fraudulent document right now, his entire demeanor would instantly shift. He would immediately realize I had discovered his massive web of lies. He would know his 5-year scam was completely exposed. If he panicked, he could immediately flee back to his multi-million-dollar mansion in Austin, drain all of his offshore accounts, and disappear with my daughter's stolen trust fund before Maxwell could freeze his assets. I needed to keep him feeling absolutely victorious and totally secure in his assumed superiority. But I also could not legally hand over the deed to my house and the entirety of my life savings to a ruthless predator. A structural engineer never walks onto a compromised site without a safety harness. I needed to trigger his trap without getting caught in the steel jaws. I let a long, heavy sigh escape my lungs as if the emotional weight of my daughter's impending brain surgery was crushing my spirit. I looked up at him with watery, defeated eyes. I told him I just wanted my little girl to wake up and smile again. I told him I would do whatever the Seattle surgical team required to ensure she survived the night. I watched the subtle, greedy twitch of a muscle near his jawline. He was practically vibrating with the anticipation of securing my entire net worth. Wyatt leaned forward eagerly over the glass coffee table. He tapped the heavy silver pen against the documents, urging me to finalize the transaction. He told me this was the only way to save her, and that I was doing the absolute right thing as a loving father. I reached out and took the pen from his meticulously manicured hand. I did not grip the metal barrel firmly. I let my fingers tremble visibly under the warm living room lights. I channeled every ounce of the physical exhaustion I had felt over the last 5 years into my hands. I made the pen shake violently over the paper. I let my breathing grow shallow and irregular, mimicking the intense physical anxiety of an aging, desperate man pushed to his absolute breaking point. Wyatt watched my shaking hand with a sickening expression of profound greed masked by a very thin veneer of artificial sympathy. He told me to just take my time, but his rigid body language screamed for me to hurry up. I pressed the pen tip against the thick paper. I began to write my name. I wrote the first few letters of my first name with a deliberate, agonizing slowness. I pressed too hard, making the ink blot slightly on the page. Then I moved to my last name. I signed it exactly the way I had practiced, perfectly simulating a severe neurological tremor of a senior citizen under extreme psychological distress. But as I reached the very last letter of my surname, I executed a highly specific, calculated deviation. Instead of completing the fluid looping stroke that characterized my official signature for the last 40 years, I abruptly dragged the pen straight down. I terminated the line with a sharp, disconnected, and jagged slash. It looked exactly like the clumsy, erratic mistake of an emotionally devastated old man whose hand had simply given out from sheer panic. To Wyatt, it was just a messy signature on a highly lucrative, legally binding document. He quickly snatched the paper off the table the exact second the pen lifted from the page. He blew on the ink to dry it and shoved the entire packet back into his sleek leather briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut. He stood up immediately, adjusting his tailored suit jacket and wiping away his fake tears. He thanked me profusely and promised to call me the exact second Camille was out of the experimental surgery. I walked him to the door and watched him stride down the driveway. I watched him walk out of my life with a victorious bounce in his step, completely unaware of the radioactive bomb he had just placed in his own briefcase. As soon as the red taillights of his luxury sedan disappeared down my quiet street, I walked back inside and locked the deadbolt. I picked up my secure phone and dialed Maxwell Reed. I told him the package was officially in transit. Maxwell chuckled deeply on the other end of the line. 3 days ago, before Wyatt even showed up on my front porch, Maxwell and I had anticipated this exact aggressive maneuver. Financial predators like Wyatt are deeply predictable creatures. When they feel their primary cash flow slowing down, they immediately make a massive, desperate grab for the absolute biggest asset available. In my case, that was my fully paid-off house and my unencumbered retirement accounts. Maxwell had called me into his downtown Dallas office and sat me down in front of a licensed state notary and a certified forensic handwriting expert. We legally executed a highly classified sworn affidavit. The document officially declared that my authentic legal signature required a specific looping final stroke. The affidavit explicitly stated that if any legal document ever surfaced bearing my signature with a sharp, downward disconnected slash at the end, it was absolute undeniable proof that the signature was extracted under severe psychological duress, coercion, or direct physical threat. It rendered any contract, deed, or power of attorney instantly and permanently void under federal and state law. Maxwell had filed the affidavit under seal with the state registry, creating an impenetrable legal firewall around my entire estate. Wyatt thought he had just successfully stolen a lifetime of my hard-earned wealth with a clever sleight of hand. In reality, he had just accepted a completely worthless piece of paper that legally documented his active attempt to defraud a senior citizen. My house was completely safe. My money was completely safe. Wyatt had simply handed me the exact physical weapon I needed to destroy his entire false empire in a court of law. I poured the cold coffee down the kitchen sink and felt the immense satisfaction of a perfectly executed architectural failsafe. I spent the rest of the evening organizing the digital audio files from the hidden microphone under the kitchen island. I meticulously labeled the recordings of his extortion attempt and uploaded them to the secure server I shared with Maxwell and Jackson. At exactly 11 o'clock that night, my phone buzzed with an urgent priority message from Jackson. I opened the encrypted application, expecting a routine update on Wyatt's highway travel. Jackson did not just send a text. He sent a series of high-resolution surveillance photographs taken with a powerful telephoto lens. The pictures showed Wyatt walking into a dimly lit, highly secured private club in the Warehouse district of Austin. It was a location heavily guarded by men in dark suits and known exclusively to the criminal underworld. Jackson reported that Wyatt had not gone home to his multi-million-dollar mansion to celebrate his fake victory with Sylvia. He had driven straight to a meeting with a notoriously violent syndicate of private hard money lenders. He had desperately needed massive capital to fund a new fraudulent tech startup, and his legitimate credit lines were completely exhausted. Jackson confirmed the absolute worst-case scenario for Wyatt. He had just used the fraudulent transfer on death deed containing my intentionally voided signature as collateral to secure a $2 million illegal cash loan. Wyatt had successfully tricked a cartel of ruthless criminals using a completely worthless piece of paper. He thought he was a brilliant financial mastermind playing a high-stakes game of corporate chess. He did not realize he had just wrapped a thick, heavy noose directly around his own neck and handed the rope to the most dangerous men in Texas. He had leveraged assets he did not own, using a signature that did not legally exist to borrow money from people who do not use the legal system to collect their debts. The structural failure of his life was no longer just a legal or financial matter. It was now a matter of physical survival. The walls of his invisible prison were rapidly closing in, and he had locked the door from the inside. The morning after Wyatt secured his illegal loan from the Austin criminal syndicate, I called Camille at her secure hotel. It was finally time to execute the primary demolition sequence. Wyatt had survived for half a decade by acting as a highly efficient parasite. He had attached himself to my daughter's trust fund and my monthly engineering pension, siphoning off our resources to feed his own bloated existence. Now that he had foolishly exposed his flank to the criminal underworld, we needed to immediately choke his legitimate cash flow down to absolute zero. I explained the situation to Camille. Her voice coming through the phone was no longer that of a frightened, heavily medicated victim trapped in a Seattle suburb. It was the clear, resonant voice of a woman who had finally seen the complete architectural blueprint of her own cage and was entirely ready to tear it down to the foundation. We gave Maxwell Reed the official green light to proceed with the legal strike. Cutting off a financial parasite requires absolute precision and overwhelming brute force. You do not just stop sending them money. You block every single valve they have previously established. You isolate the contamination completely so the host can finally begin to heal. The time for silent observation was officially over. We were pressing the button to initiate the financial counterattack. The very next morning, Maxwell Reed walked into the federal courthouse in downtown Dallas. He did not file a standard civil complaint. He filed an emergency ex parte motion for a temporary restraining order and a sweeping asset freeze. He brought a terrifying, meticulously organized arsenal of irrefutable evidence. He presented the 60 wire transfer receipts I had painstakingly gathered. He submitted the verified hospital discharge records proving Camille had been completely healthy and physically independent for 4.5 years. He provided the sworn forensic affidavit regarding my intentionally voided signature preventing any legal transfer of my estate. The most devastating piece of evidence, however, was the comprehensive financial tracing report Jackson had compiled. It definitively proved that every single dollar from Camille's maternal trust fund and my monthly pension was actively being funneled directly into the corporate shell account registered as Camille's Hope Foundation. The federal judge reviewed the massive glaring discrepancy between the medical reality and the financial deception. The judge did not see a simple domestic dispute. The judge saw a highly organized wire fraud operation actively exploiting a vulnerable woman and systematically defrauding an elderly man across state lines. The response was immediate and absolutely brutal. The federal court granted the emergency injunction without a single moment of hesitation. They issued a comprehensive freeze order on every single bank account, investment portfolio, and credit line tied to Wyatt and his fraudulent charity. The judge also forwarded the entire unredacted docket directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation for immediate criminal review. Maxwell called me just before noon to confirm the payload had been successfully delivered and detonated. The legal guillotine had dropped with absolute perfection. The financial blood supply was completely and permanently severed. Every single account Wyatt possessed was instantly locked tight by the federal government. He could not withdraw a single penny. He could not transfer funds to an offshore safe haven. He could not even buy a cheap cup of coffee using his corporate funds. The massive financial structure he had built was now hanging entirely in midair with absolutely zero foundational support. While the federal banking system systematically locked down his entire existence, Wyatt was completely oblivious. He was busy living the life of an elite Texas aristocrat. Jackson's daily surveillance reports painted a sickening vivid picture of the sheer excess Wyatt and his second wife Sylvia indulged in on a daily basis. They were not just living comfortably, they were burning through my daughter's stolen inheritance with an obscene, breathtaking arrogance. Sylvia drove a custom-imported luxury SUV that cost more than my first 3 houses combined. She spent her afternoons at exclusive day spas and high-end medical boutiques sipping champagne while getting expensive cosmetic treatments. Wyatt proudly wore $50,000 watches and hosted extravagant catered parties by their custom infinity pool. He had carefully cultivated an image of a brilliant self-made tech visionary. He told his wealthy neighbors and his elite country club associates that his massive wealth came from a series of highly successful early-stage software acquisitions. Sylvia paraded around her social circles, boasting loudly about her husband's incredible business acumen. She truly believed she was married to a modern titan of industry. She had absolutely no idea that her designer wardrobe, her weekly caviar dinners, and her massive stone mansion were paid for by the stolen trust fund of a woman trapped in a lonely house in Seattle. She did not know that her luxurious lifestyle was actively subsidized by the monthly pension of a retired black engineer she would never even acknowledge on the street. Wyatt had built a pristine, beautiful life for Sylvia, directly on top of Camille's broken spirit and my hard physical labor. He played the benevolent, wealthy provider for his white suburban family while simultaneously starving, isolating, and gaslighting his actual legal wife. The sheer volume of his hypocrisy was staggering to witness. But the absolute worst part of his extravagant lifestyle was the massive, unsustainable burn rate. Wyatt was spending the stolen money significantly faster than he could launder it. That was exactly why he needed that dangerous $2 million loan from the criminal syndicate. He needed to feed the monstrous lifestyle he had created before Sylvia and his elite peers realized he was completely broke. He was a man desperately bailing water out of a sinking luxury yacht. That evening, Wyatt decided to take Sylvia to the most exclusive Michelin-starred restaurant in downtown Austin to celebrate his new influx of syndicate cash. He wanted to project absolute financial dominance. Jackson had a covert operative sitting just 2 tables away, perfectly positioned to witness the exact moment the structural collapse reached the penthouse. Wyatt confidently ordered vintage champagne, imported Wagyu beef, and rare truffles. He laughed loudly and played the part of the untouchable billionaire perfectly. When the final bill arrived, totaling over $3,000, he casually dropped his heavy metal corporate black card onto the leather presentation tray. The waiter walked away with a polite bow, only to return 3 minutes later looking deeply uncomfortable. He leaned in and quietly informed Wyatt that the card had been declined. Wyatt chuckled arrogantly, blaming a simple banking error or a fraud alert limit. He confidently handed the waiter a different premium credit card from a completely different bank. That card was also instantly declined. Then his personal debit card was rejected. The color completely drained from Wyatt's face, leaving him looking like a pale ghost. Sylvia looked at him with mounting profound embarrassment as nearby wealthy diners began to stare at the commotion. Wyatt grabbed his phone and frantically dialed his private wealth manager at his primary bank. He aggressively demanded to know why his accounts were malfunctioning during a highly important business dinner. The response he received must have felt like a physical sledgehammer blow to his chest. The banker informed him in a cold corporate tone that his entire financial portfolio had been completely frozen by a direct federal court order. The banker explicitly stated that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had flagged his accounts for massive wire fraud, money laundering, and elder abuse. The phone slipped from Wyatt's trembling hand and clattered loudly against the expensive hardwood restaurant floor. The invisible web had officially snapped tight. He was completely trapped. I sat in the pitch black of my Texas study, listening to the steady, relentless ticking of the vintage wall clock. The federal asset freeze had taken full effect several hours ago, but the shock waves were just beginning to reach the epicenter of the target. A massive structural collapse is never just one single sudden sound. It is a complex series of violent snaps, deep metallic groans, and terrible shifting pressures as the immense weight redistributes itself onto failing support columns. I was wide awake, simply waiting for the inevitable noise of the building coming down. At exactly 2 a.m, my secure phone violently shattered the absolute silence of the house. The bright digital screen illuminated the dark mahogany wood of my drafting desk. The caller ID displayed Wyatt's name in glaring white letters. I did not answer immediately. I sat back in my heavy leather chair and let the device ring 3 full times. A truly desperate man needs to feel the full, agonizing weight of his own rising panic. He needs to realize deep in his bones that he is no longer the one dictating the terms of engagement. He needs to stew in the terrifying unknown. On the 4th ring, I swiped the screen and brought the receiver to my ear. I did not say a single welcoming word. I simply listened to the ragged, frantic, and heavy breathing on the other end of the cellular line. Wyatt had completely lost his polished corporate veneer. The arrogant tech billionaire who had confidently ordered vintage champagne and imported Wagyu beef just a few hours ago was totally gone. He was instantly replaced by a cornered feral animal bleeding out in the dark. Morgan, he growled, his voice vibrating with a toxic, volatile mix of sheer panic and unhinged rage. "I know exactly what you did, you old fool. I know you called the bank and made some kind of insane domestic fraud claim." Wyatt did not know about the FBI involvement or the sweeping federal injunction yet. His massive, unearned ego convinced him this was just a temporary administrative hurdle I had somehow triggered to punish him for the fake surgery bill. He demanded I call my private wealth manager immediately and retract whatever statements I had made. He screamed that I was ruining his stellar reputation and directly jeopardizing his entire venture capital funding round. I remained absolutely silent, letting him exhaust his initial burst of adrenaline. I let his threats hang in the empty air like useless wooden arrows bouncing off solid steel armor. When my silence stretched on too long, his anger morphed into the darkest, most depraved psychological extortion a human being could ever weaponize. He dropped his voice into a low, menacing hiss. He told me that the highly experimental facility housing Camille operated on a strict upfront payment schedule. He said the life support machines, the feeding tubes, and the specialized 24-hour neurological care required massive daily capital. He explicitly threatened that if his personal accounts were not completely unfrozen by sunrise, he would be forced to make the tragic medical decision to end her suffering. He said he would drive directly to the facility, sign the administrative authorization papers, and literally pull the plug on my only daughter. He was using the fictional life of his own wife as a direct bargaining chip to secure his stolen luxury lifestyle. He promised to let her suffocate to death if I did not restore his access to my money. The absolute sheer cruelty of his threat would have utterly destroyed a normal grieving father. It was designed to completely break my spirit and force me into an immediate blind submission. But I was not a grieving father anymore. I was the architect of his total annihilation. As he ranted aggressively about pulling the plug and planning a cheap funeral, my mind systematically dissected the profound depth of his 5-year medical illusion. Over the past 60 months, there were times when my desperate, aching need to see my daughter briefly overpowered my logical adherence to his strict visitation rules. When I would aggressively demand a video call, Wyatt would always make me wait for weeks, claiming he needed special clearance from the facility director to bypass the visual stimulation protocols. When the video call finally happened, the production value was sickeningly meticulous. He would call me from a dimly lit, sterile-looking room. I would see a standard hospital bed in the background, surrounded by complex medical monitors flashing rhythmic green lines and emitting steady beeps. There would be a woman lying motionless in the bed, hooked to a mechanical ventilator with her face partially obscured by thick white bandages and a heavy oxygen mask. He told me the bandages were absolutely necessary due to recurrent skin graft surgeries from the horrific crash. I now knew that entire setup was a highly orchestrated theatrical set. Jackson had uncovered the digital receipts during his comprehensive financial sweep. Wyatt had rented a cheap, windowless commercial office space on the remote industrial outskirts of Seattle. He had purchased surplus medical equipment from liquidation auctions and hospital bankruptcy sales. He literally hired a struggling local actress to lay perfectly still in that bed, with her face covered in gauze, just to satisfy my paternal desperation for 5 agonizing minutes every 6 months. A lie of that massive magnitude requires constant structural maintenance. He had to ensure the actress kept her mouth shut. He had to pay rent on a fake medical room he used twice a year. He managed all these moving parts while living a double life in Texas. He directed those video calls like a sociopathic movie producer, carefully controlling the dim lighting, the tight camera angles, and the ambient background sound. He spent thousands of dollars from the retirement money I sent him just to maintain the physical prop of my daughter's endless coma. He had built a literal stage play out of my profound grief. He had monetized my pain with the cold precision of a professional monster. I listened to his frantic breathing on the phone as he waited for my terrified, weeping surrender. He expected me to beg for Camille's life and promised to wire him whatever funds he demanded. Instead, I let out a low, cold, and completely joyless laugh. The sound echoed harshly in my quiet study, slicing right through his arrogant threats. Wyatt stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. The complete absence of fear in my voice completely derailed his entire psychological script. I leaned into the microphone and spoke with absolute freezing clarity. "Pull it, Wyatt. Go ahead and pull the plug tonight." The absolute dead silence that followed my words was the sweetest sound I had heard in 5 years. I could physically feel his entire false reality snapping completely in half over the cellular connection. He stammered frantically, trying to form a coherent sentence. He could not comprehend why a desperate, loving father would calmly authorize the execution of his own child. He realized in that exact, terrifying instant that his ultimate supreme leverage was completely useless. I hung up the phone and severed the connection permanently. Jackson sent me a real-time geolocation tracking update less than 3 minutes later. Wyatt had sprinted out of his Austin mansion, jumped into his luxury sports car, and was currently speeding down the empty Texas highway at 90 miles an hour. He was racing blindly into the night, desperately trying to figure out exactly how the old black engineer he constantly underestimated had completely rigged his entire life to explode. The demolition sequence was proceeding flawlessly. As Wyatt sped through the dark Texas night, his severely compromised brain finally connected the catastrophic dots. The frozen bank accounts at the upscale restaurant, the completely deadpan response to his ultimate threat regarding the life support machines. He finally realized his elaborate 5-year medical illusion was completely shattered. He did not know exactly how I found out the truth about Camille, but he knew the federal government was rapidly closing in on his massive fraud operation. A desperate, cornered predator does not surrender quietly to the authorities. It thrashes wildly and looks for an immediate escape route. Wyatt had an angry criminal syndicate breathing down his neck and zero access to his own stolen wealth. He needed an untraceable physical asset to secure a forged passport and flee the country by dawn before the cartel or the federal agents found him. He knew he possessed the fraudulent transfer on death deed bearing my intentionally botched signature in his leather briefcase. But in the ruthless underground black market, a shady power of attorney is practically useless without the original physical property deed to back it up. He needed the hard, authentic paper proving absolute ownership of my unencumbered real estate to satisfy his dangerous creditors or secure a massive underground loan. He knew exactly where I kept all my vital legal documents. He made a sharp, reckless turn across the highway, median tires screeching against the asphalt. He abandoned his desperate trip to the fake Seattle medical facility and pointed his luxury sports car directly toward my empty brick house. I was not sitting in my dark study waiting for a violent physical confrontation. A master engineer does not stand directly underneath a falling wrecking ball. Earlier that afternoon, I had packed my remaining essentials and quietly relocated to a highly secure, unmarked hotel suite in downtown Dallas. I sat comfortably at a small glass desk bathed in the soft blue glow of my laptop screen. I had recently installed a comprehensive grid of hidden high-definition infrared security cameras throughout the entire interior and exterior of my property. I watched the live black and white feed with total clinical detachment, sipping a cup of hot black coffee. At exactly 3:45 in the morning, a sleek, dark vehicle rolled silently to a stop at the very end of my quiet street, avoiding the glow of the streetlights. Wyatt stepped out into the humid night air. He pulled the hood of his dark jacket over his head and retrieved a heavy steel crowbar from his trunk. He crept through my neighbor's side yard and hopped the wooden fence into my backyard with practiced stealth. He moved with the frantic, sloppy urgency of a man running completely out of time. I watched him approach the heavy glass sliding door of my rear patio. He wrapped a thick, dark towel around the heavy flat end of his crowbar and struck the glass pane right near the locking mechanism. The tempered glass shattered instantly, raining sharp, crystalline pieces onto the hardwood floor with a muffled crash. He reached carefully through the jagged hole, unlocked the deadbolt, and slid the heavy door open. He stepped into my kitchen, sweeping the dark room with a small tactical flashlight. I watched his glowing thermal heat signature move rapidly down the hallway and directly into my primary study. He did not bother looking for loose cash or easily pawned electronics in the living room. He was hunting for the absolute biggest prize available. He walked straight past my mahogany drafting desk and knelt directly in front of the heavy iron door of my floor safe, bolted firmly into the concrete foundation. He wiped sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. He examined the tight seal around the heavy door and gripped his steel tool with both hands. He was entirely focused on his impending salvation, completely unaware he was starring in a live broadcast of his own burglary. That vintage iron safe was a massive psychological obsession for Wyatt. From the very first day he stepped foot in my house 5 years ago to play the role of the grieving son-in-law, he had fixated heavily on that impenetrable steel box. During his calculated visits to collect my monthly pension checks, he would constantly throw sideways, greedy glances at the heavy brass combination dial. He frequently tried to manipulate me into revealing its exact contents. He would casually bring up the inherent dangers of keeping physical cash in the house, or the tragic risks of losing uninsured family heirlooms to unexpected electrical fires. He desperately wanted to know exactly what an aging, retired structural engineer deemed valuable enough to lock behind 3 solid inches of reinforced steel. I always gave him the exact same vague, boring answer to deflect his prying questions. I told him it just held old, boring tax returns from the 1980s and useless expired appliance warranties. But his profound, unearned arrogance and his insatiable, overwhelming greed convinced him I was absolutely lying. He firmly believed I was secretly hoarding a massive hidden fortune in untraceable gold bullion or high-carat diamonds. He thought my modest working-class lifestyle was just a clever, deceptive front covering up millions of dollars in liquid assets. Every single time he visited my home, he tried to memorize my hand movements if I ever went anywhere near the study. He actively hunted for written combinations hidden under my desk blotter or inside my reference books. He lusted after the contents of that safe with a sick, heavy desperation because he viewed every single thing I owned as his inherent rightful property. He believed his marriage to my daughter automatically entitled him to the absolute totality of my life's work. Now he was finally alone in the dark with the ultimate object of his intense 5-year obsession. He firmly wedged the sharp, flat edge of his steel crowbar right into the tight seam between the iron door and the reinforced steel frame. He grunted heavily, throwing his entire body weight against the long lever. He was completely blinded by the absolute certainty that his ultimate financial salvation was locked right behind that thick metal door. The vintage locking mechanism was never designed to withstand a brutal, sustained assault with a heavy industrial lever. With a loud, agonizing metallic screech, the internal steel pins snapped completely in half. Wyatt ripped the heavy iron door wide open and shined his tactical flashlight directly into the dark interior cavity. He immediately froze. His thermal heat signature stood perfectly still on my computer monitor. There were no neat stacks of $100 bills. There were no heavy gold bars. There was no original property deed to secure his escape from the country. Inside the empty safe sat a single large high-resolution photograph propped up against the cold steel back wall. It was the picture Brenda had taken just 2 days ago. It showed Camille standing in the bright Seattle shopping mall, smiling radiantly and holding the hand of her healthy 3-year-old son. Taped directly to the center of my daughter's smiling face was a bright yellow sticky note bearing a simple handwritten message written in thick black marker. "My lawyer is waiting for you in hell, you bastard." Wyatt dropped the flashlight in sheer horror. It rolled across the floor, casting wild, moving shadows across the walls. He stumbled backward, hitting my heavy wooden desk hard. At that exact split second, the blaring mechanical wail of police sirens completely shattered the quiet night. I had triggered the silent alarm the exact moment he shattered my back door, allowing the patrol cars to position themselves perfectly. Flashing red and blue lights instantly illuminated my front lawn, throwing aggressive colors through the study blinds. Wyatt let out a terrified primal scream. He abandoned his crowbar, turned blindly away from the hallway, and violently threw his entire body straight through the closed glass window of my study to escape into the dark woods. Wyatt crashed heavily through the thick glass of my study window, sending sharp shards flying into the humid night air. He landed violently in the muddy flower beds outside, leaving a long, dark trail of blood from deep lacerations on his forearms and his face. He scrambled frantically into the dense tree line just as the local police cruisers skidded to a halt in my driveway, their sirens wailing loudly. He was physically battered, bleeding, and completely cut off from his vital financial lifelines. Jackson intercepted his frantic digital communications later that morning using our highly secure surveillance network. Wyatt had quickly discovered the absolute worst news possible for a man on the run. His passport had been officially flagged by federal authorities. He could not board a commercial flight out of the state. He could not safely cross the international border. Furthermore, the criminal syndicate was actively hunting him down for the $2 million he had recklessly borrowed against my completely worthless property deed. He was trapped inside the country with predators closing in from all sides. He desperately needed a massive amount of untraceable physical cash to pay an underground smuggler to get him out on an illegal cargo ship. With his bank accounts completely frozen by the federal court and his credit cards declining at every single terminal, he had only one remaining vehicle for liquid capital, the Camille Hope Foundation. He decided to execute one final massive scam before the federal arrest warrants became public knowledge and his face was plastered across the evening news. He was going to squeeze his wealthy social circle completely dry one last time to fund his desperate escape. Operating entirely from a cheap prepaid burner phone hidden inside a seedy roadside motel room, Wyatt began making urgent calls. He leveraged every single ounce of his remaining social capital to organize a high-profile charity gala in downtown Austin. He targeted the absolute most exclusive 5-star hotel in the city for the venue. He could not pay the massive upfront deposit required for the grand ballroom, so he deployed his ultimate weapon of emotional manipulation. He called the hotel management and wept hysterically into the receiver. He claimed Camille's fragile condition had suddenly and tragically deteriorated over the weekend. He told them she was in her absolute final days of life, clinging to a ventilator. He spun a devastating, highly calculated tale about needing to host an emergency fundraiser to secure a miracle experimental treatment before the end of the week. The hotel management completely fell for his desperate performance. They waived the standard fees and allowed him to book their grand ballroom and catering services on pure credit. Wyatt worked with the frantic, terrifying energy of a cornered rat facing immediate extermination. He sent out urgent digital invitations to the wealthiest investors, venture capitalists, and socialites in the Texas tech sphere. He marketed the gala as the ultimate heroic effort to save a dying woman. His primary objective was highly specific and entirely criminal. He wanted to collect physical cashier checks and direct offshore cryptocurrency transfers during the live auction portion of the evening. He planned to pocket the untraceable funds, step quietly out the back door of the luxury hotel, and vanish into the night forever, leaving his fake charity and his mounting debts completely behind. He rented a pristine black tuxedo using the very last few $100s of cash he had in his pocket. He tightly bandaged the deep bloody cuts on his arms and used heavy theatrical makeup to hide the dark fresh bruises on his face. He transformed himself back into the polished, grieving tech billionaire ready to fleece his elite peers one last time. To understand exactly how Wyatt could pull off such a massive brazen event on just a few days, notice you have to understand the profound psychological manipulation he had inflicted on the Austin elite. Over the past 5 years, he had carefully cultivated a flawless, pristine public persona. He was the ultimate tragic hero of the high society philanthropic circuit. He mingled seamlessly with old money oil tycoons and new money tech billionaires using a highly specific brand of emotional extortion. He played the role of the devoted, noble husband who sacrificed his own soaring entrepreneurial ambitions to care for his comatose wife. The wealthy white elite of Austin absolutely loved his story. They loved it because he looked exactly like them. He spoke their exclusive corporate language and wore their preferred luxury designer brands. His tragic narrative provided them with the perfect philanthropic optics for their own public relations. They threw thousands of dollars at his fake foundation because it made them feel morally superior to support such a handsome, dedicated martyr. Wyatt expertly weaponized their inherent biases and their massive unearned privilege. He knew they would never demand to see actual medical records or audit the foundation's financial spending. Asking a weeping, wealthy white man for proof of his trauma was considered a severe social violation in those circles. He exploited their desire for a clean, simple charity case that required zero critical thinking or follow-up. He told them he was a widower in practice, but a deeply committed husband in spirit. They patted him on the back at exclusive country club dinners and praised his incredible resilience. He built an impenetrable shield of social protection out of their blind, arrogant assumptions. He knew exactly which emotional buttons to press to make their thick checkbooks open wide. He was banking heavily on that exact same unchecked privilege to carry him through this final desperate cash grab before his entire life completely imploded. The night of the grand charity gala arrived with heavy rain pouring over the vibrant city of Austin. Wyatt stood in the opulent marble foyer of the grand ballroom holding a crystal glass of sparkling water. He had brazenly brought his second wife Sylvia to the high-profile event. He introduced her to the arriving billionaires as the dedicated foundation co-director who had been his selfless emotional rock during his darkest hours. He stood there smiling bravely, receiving sympathetic handshakes and quietly collecting thick envelopes of cash and checks from oblivious donors. Soft classical music played in the background, masking the absolute desperation pounding in his chest. He looked confidently at the massive private security detail stationed at every single entrance of the luxury hotel. He felt completely invincible inside his luxurious, expensive fortress surrounded by his wealthy peers. He was absolutely certain that an aging, retired black engineer from a modest working-class neighborhood could never possibly infiltrate the most exclusive high society gathering in the state. He thought I was just a simple blue-collar worker who lacked the sophistication and the resources to navigate past the velvet ropes and the armed guards. He assumed my reach ended at my own front door. He severely underestimated the absolute power of an angry father and the brutal efficiency of a ruthless corporate lawyer. He had no idea that I was already inside the building. A sleek black town car pulled up to the grand entrance of the luxury hotel, cutting through the heavy Austin rain. The valet rushed forward with a large black umbrella, opening the heavy rear door. I stepped out onto the wet pavement, planting my oak walking cane firmly against the concrete. I was wearing a sharply tailored black tuxedo, a stark departure from my usual worn flannel shirts and faded work trousers. I reached my hand back into the vehicle, and my daughter took it. Camille stepped out into the humid night air. She was wearing a stunning floor-length black evening gown that completely wrapped her in an aura of absolute dark elegance. Her posture was completely rigid and perfectly straight. We did not look like an aging engineer and a traumatized housewife. We looked like the inevitable physical manifestation of absolute justice arriving to collect a massive outstanding debt. The heavy glass doors of the hotel parted for us. We walked directly into the opulent marble lobby, ignoring the valet and the bellhops. The air smelled of expensive floral arrangements and roasted duck. The distant sound of a string quartet floated down the sweeping grand staircase. We moved with a silent, synchronized, and lethal purpose. This was the exact moment I had meticulously calculated for weeks, the final stress test on a totally corrupt foundation. Maxwell Reed is a man who understands that every single fortress has a back door if you have enough money and the right leverage. Wyatt had hired a massive private security detail to guard the velvet ropes of the grand ballroom, but he failed to secure the primary VIP guest list. Maxwell had effortlessly bypassed Wyatt's pathetic security perimeter by purchasing 2 platinum sponsor tickets through a corporate shell entity earlier that afternoon. We approached the primary security checkpoint at the top of the grand staircase. The massive armed guards in black suits barely glanced at us as they scanned our platinum digital barcodes. The automated system flashed a bright green light of approval. We walked past the armed perimeter and slipped silently into the heavy shadows at the very back of the sprawling grand ballroom. The room was a massive sea of glittering crystal chandeliers and tables draped in pure white silk. Hundreds of Austin elites sat completely captivated by the stage at the front of the room. Wyatt was standing directly behind a clear acrylic podium bathed in a soft, dramatic spotlight. He was delivering the performance of his absolute life. He held a microphone with both hands, bowing his head slightly to project a deep, profound sorrow. He spoke in a shaky, highly practiced whisper about the agonizing pain of watching the woman he loved slowly slip away. He told the audience about the relentless beeping of the life support machines, the cold, sterile walls of the facility, and the crushing emotional weight of endless hospital bills. He actually squeezed his eyes shut and let real tears fall onto the podium. He begged the room for their generous financial support, claiming a new experimental European treatment was his final desperate hope to bring his beautiful wife back from the absolute brink of death. I watched the wealthy tech billionaires and oil tycoons pull out their checkbooks, wiping away their own sympathetic tears. They were actively writing massive checks to a phantom cause. Wyatt was successfully looting the entire room right in front of my eyes. In the front row, I could see Sylvia wiping her own eyes, playing the role of the supportive foundation co-director, completely ignorant of the fact that the dying woman her husband was describing was currently standing right behind her. I looked at Camille, standing perfectly still beside me in the dark shadows of the ballroom. I remembered the broken, terrified woman I had found in that Seattle house just a few short weeks ago. She had been a hollow shell of a human being, completely paralyzed by Wyatt's relentless psychological warfare. He had systematically stripped away her confidence, her independence, and her fundamental grip on reality. He convinced her she was a helpless burden entirely dependent on his fabricated grace. He had forced her to take heavy, unnecessary sedatives, claiming they were for her neurological stability, when in reality, they were just chemical chains meant to keep her docile and confused. But Wyatt made a massive, fatal miscalculation. He forgot exactly whose blood pumped through her veins. He forgot that she was raised by a man who built towering steel structures designed to withstand Category 5 hurricanes. Over the past several days, I watched my daughter undergo a profound and terrifying metamorphosis. The crippling anxiety and the heavy fog of domestic abuse completely evaporated from her eyes. She threw the heavy bottles of fake medication directly into the hotel trash can. She stopped weeping over the years she had lost and began meticulously analyzing the financial documents Jackson provided. She sat next to me at the hotel desk, tracing Wyatt's fraudulent routing numbers and identifying his offshore shell companies with the exact same cold, calculated precision I used to locate structural fractures in load-bearing columns. She shed the identity of the submissive victim and fully embraced the identity of the architect of his destruction. She was no longer afraid of the man standing on that stage. She viewed him simply as a highly defective building that needed to be aggressively and permanently demolished. The black gown she wore tonight was not just formal attire. It was a physical declaration of war. She stood tall, her jaw clenched tight, her eyes locked directly onto the man who had stolen half a decade of her life. She was a weapon fully loaded and perfectly aimed. The warrior spirit of her ancestors had completely overwritten the programmed fear he had instilled in her. Wyatt reached the absolute emotional climax of his fraudulent speech. He raised his hand toward the ceiling, asking the elite crowd to open their hearts and their wallets to save his dying Camille. He paused for dramatic effect, waiting for the massive flood of charitable donations. He looked out over the crowd with a sickening expression of false humility masking his total triumphant greed. I looked at Camille and gave her a single sharp nod. It was time to pull the final structural pin. I raised my heavy oak cane and struck the massive brass handles of the primary ballroom doors with brutal, bone-jarring force. The heavy doors swung violently outward, crashing loudly against the interior walls. The sudden explosive sound echoed across the massive room, completely shattering the somber classical music. The hotel audio-visual technician who Jackson had generously bribed earlier that evening instantly executed his single crucial task. A massive, blinding white spotlight swiveled sharply away from the stage and cut directly through the darkness of the room, illuminating the grand entrance. The intense beam hit Camille perfectly. She stepped forward out of the shadows and directly into the blinding light. She was not in a coma. She was not hooked to a ventilator. She looked absolutely breathtaking, completely healthy, and radiating an overwhelming lethal fury. She wrapped her arm firmly around my elbow, and we began walking slowly down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. The rhythmic, heavy thud of my oak cane against the marble floor sounded like the relentless ticking of a bomb. The entire room went completely dead silent. The wealthy donors froze with their pens hovering over their checkbooks, heads turned in total mass confusion. I locked my eyes directly on Wyatt. He stood completely paralyzed behind the acrylic podium. The blood drained so fast from his face that he looked like a freshly exhumed corpse. His mouth opened, but absolutely no sound came out. The microphone slipped from his trembling hand and crashed onto the wooden stage with a deafening screech of audio feedback. The silent adjustment had entered its final, most devastating phase. Wyatt scrambled backward, knocking over the heavy acrylic podium. The microphone shrieked against the polished wooden floor. He looked at Camille as if a ghost had just materialized from the marble tiles to drag him straight to hell. His perfectly constructed facade evaporated instantly. He frantically waved his arms at the private security guards stationed around the perimeter of the room. He screamed into the broken microphone, his voice cracking with absolute sheer panic, ordering the guards to remove the intruders. He yelled that we were deranged stalkers trying to sabotage a highly sensitive charity event. The heavily armed men in black suits began to move forward through the sea of tables. The wealthy attendees murmured in total confusion, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Wyatt thought brute force could still save his collapsing empire. He thought his rented muscle could drag the terrifying truth right out the back door before anyone realized the massive extent of his lies. But he failed to account for the meticulous planning of a master structural engineer. He did not realize that the security team was already completely neutralized. I raised my left hand. Jackson stepped out from the deep shadows near the primary audiovisual booth. He held up a thick manila folder containing the signed federal injunctions and flashed a confident, highly menacing smile at the head of hotel security. The security chief immediately raised his radio and explicitly ordered his men to stand down. Wyatt was completely exposed and entirely stripped of his physical defenses. I did not run toward the stage. I walked with the slow, deliberate, and heavy rhythm of a man who firmly owned the entire room. Camille walked right beside me, her head held high, staring unblinkingly at the man who had imprisoned her in a suburban nightmare for 5 years. The crowd parted for us like the Red Sea. Whispers rippled rapidly through the elite audience as they recognized the striking resemblance between the vibrant, powerful woman in the black evening gown and the tragic, frail photographs Wyatt had plastered across his promotional brochures. I stepped up the short flight of wooden stairs leading to the main stage, planting my oak cane firmly on each step. Wyatt backed away from me, pressing his spine firmly against the massive white projection screen. He looked exactly like a trapped rat, shivering under the bright, intense stage lights. I bent down, picked up the fallen microphone from the wooden floorboards, and turned to face the hundreds of wealthy investors staring up at me. I introduced myself with absolute freezing clarity. I told them my name was Morgan, and I was the biological father of the woman Wyatt claimed was dying on a medical ventilator. I pointed my heavy oak cane directly at Camille standing proudly at the foot of the stage. I announced to the entire room that my daughter was not in a coma. She was not dying. She had been fully recovered and entirely healthy for 4.5 years. A collective loud gasp echoed across the grand ballroom. Sylvia stood up from her front row seat, her face completely drained of color, staring frantically back and forth between Wyatt and Camille. Wyatt stammered desperately, trying to spin a new, pathetic lie. He grabbed my arm, attempting to wrestle the microphone away from my grip. I simply drove the heavy rubber tip of my oak cane down hard onto the top of his expensive leather shoe. He cried out in sudden sharp pain and stumbled backward, clutching his foot. I looked at the audiovisual booth at the very back of the room and gave Jackson the final signal. Jackson moved with absolute military efficiency. He bypassed the hotel technician entirely and jammed a highly encrypted USB drive directly into the primary control console. He hit a single glowing button on the massive soundboard. The grand ballroom plunged into total immediate darkness. The classical string music cut off instantly. The massive high-definition projection screen behind Wyatt violently roared to life, casting a harsh, glaring white light over his terrified, sweating face. The ultimate presentation of his profound sins was about to officially begin. The video playing on the massive screen was an absolute masterclass in legal and emotional devastation. Maxwell Reed did not just compile raw evidence. He had directed a brutal, highly calculated documentary designed to completely obliterate Wyatt's entire existence in the eyes of his wealthy peers. Maxwell had spent 3 sleepless nights cutting and splicing the digital files we provided. He understood that high society elites do not care about dry financial spreadsheets. They care heavily about public optics, and they absolutely despise being made to look like gullible, naive fools. The video started with a crystal-clear recording of one of Wyatt's previous high-profile charity speeches. It showed him wiping fake dramatic tears from his eyes, asking for massive donations to fund Camille's non-existent physical therapy. Maxwell instantly spliced that tragic footage with the high-resolution bank statements Jackson had extracted from the Federal Wire. The screen displayed the exact routing numbers, showing those specific charitable donations flowing directly into Wyatt's personal offshore accounts. Then the audio files from the hidden microphone under my kitchen island began to play over the massive concert speakers. Wyatt's own arrogant voice boomed loudly through the silent ballroom. He was heard explicitly bragging about easily manipulating an old black man to fund his lavish startup lifestyle. He was heard calling Camille a useless burden and a captive cash cow. The crowd sat frozen in absolute sheer horror. The video masterfully juxtaposed Wyatt's public philanthropic identity with his private sociopathic monstrosity. It showed him purchasing expensive designer jewelry at high-end boutiques on the exact same days he called me weeping about expensive emergency medical procedures. It showed the fake sterile medical room he rented in Seattle, alongside the cleared checks for the struggling actress he hired to play my dying daughter. Maxwell had perfectly mapped out the complete structural anatomy of Wyatt's 5-year scam for the entire world to see. He stripped away the expensive tailored suits and the polished corporate vocabulary, exposing the highly efficient, ruthless parasite hiding underneath. The foundational pillars of Wyatt's entire social standing were aggressively pulverized in front of a live captive audience. There was absolutely nowhere left for him to hide. The presentation reached its absolute most devastating climax. The massive screen flashed to the exact audio recording of the phone call Wyatt made to me at 2 a.m. His vicious, desperate voice echoed loudly off the crystal chandeliers. The entire room listened as Wyatt explicitly threatened to walk into the medical facility and permanently pull the plug on his own wife if I did not instantly unfreeze his bank accounts. The sheer, unadulterated evil of that statement hung heavily in the dead air. Maxwell immediately intercut that terrifying death threat with crystal-clear security footage of Wyatt walking into a luxury car dealership just 2 days prior. The video showed him using the fraudulent Camille Hope Foundation corporate card to purchase a brand new imported sports car for Sylvia. The contrast was absolutely lethal. He was threatening to execute my daughter to fund a luxury vehicle for his secret second family. The grand ballroom completely erupted in absolute profound outrage. The wealthy tech billionaires and elite socialites who had just written massive donations suddenly realized they were actively funding a sociopathic predator. Men in expensive tuxedos stood up shouting furiously at the stage. Women in evening gowns covered their mouths in utter disgust. The loud sound of thick paper tearing filled the room. The elite donors were aggressively ripping their massive charitable checks into tiny, useless pieces. They threw the shredded paper onto the pristine white silk tables. Wyatt's grand final harvest was completely and permanently destroyed in a matter of seconds. The sound of thick paper tearing and wealthy donors aggressively ripping their massive charitable checks continued to echo through the grand ballroom. The entire room was completely consumed by profound outrage. It was the exact sound of a corrupt foundation shattering into 1,000 irrecoverable pieces. I stood firmly on the stage, gripping my heavy oak walking cane, and watched the secondary load-bearing pillar of Wyatt's life snap completely in half. Sylvia broke away from her front row seat. The color had entirely vanished from her face, leaving her deathly pale and visibly trembling under the harsh stage lights. She stumbled up the short wooden steps, her expensive designer heels clicking frantically against the floorboards. She shoved past the broken acrylic podium and grabbed Wyatt fiercely by the lapels of his rented black tuxedo. She shook him violently, demanding to know if the horrific video playing on the massive screen behind them was real. She screamed at him, her voice cracking with absolute sheer panic, asking if he truly bought her luxury sports car with stolen medical funds extracted from a dying woman. Wyatt raised his hands defensively, trying to deploy his usual charming manipulations. He stammered frantically, telling her it was a complex corporate misunderstanding and a vicious smear campaign orchestrated by jealous business rivals. He desperately tried to gaslight the woman he had showered with stolen wealth, but his voice completely lacked its usual arrogant bass. He was a cornered rat squeaking useless transparent lies while the massive ship rapidly sank beneath his feet. He begged her to calm down and promised he could explain the offshore accounts and the fake medical facility in Seattle. Camille did not let him finish his pathetic theatrical performance. She stepped forward, moving with the calm, fluid grace of a highly trained executioner. She did not yell at Sylvia. She did not throw a physical punch or engage in a dramatic screaming match for the entertainment of the wealthy crowd. A true master of demolition does not waste valuable energy on unnecessary explosive outbursts. They apply precise calculated pressure exactly where it causes the maximum amount of structural damage. Camille opened her sleek black clutch and pulled out two thick, legally folded documents. She walked directly up to the trembling Sylvia and slapped the papers down onto the flat surface of the broken podium right under the glaring spotlight. She leaned into the active microphone lying on the floor and spoke with a voice so cold and authoritative it commanded the absolute silent attention of every single billionaire in the room. She told Sylvia to look very closely at the official dates printed in black ink. The first document was a certified state marriage certificate proving Camille and Wyatt were legally bound years before Sylvia ever met him. The second document was a certified birth certificate for a 3-year-old boy listing Wyatt unequivocally as the biological father. Camille looked Sylvia directly in the eyes and delivered the ultimate lethal blow. She stated clearly that she was his legal wife and Sylvia was nothing but a legally void accessory to massive federal wire fraud. She informed Sylvia that their luxurious Texas marriage was entirely illegitimate and unrecognized by the state. She completely stripped away Sylvia's status as a wealthy foundation co-director and reduced her to the unwitting accomplice of a serial predator. Sylvia stared down at the official government seals stamped on the crisp white paper. Her eyes darted rapidly across the undeniable overlapping timelines. The horrific reality of her entire existence crashed down upon her shoulders with the immense, crushing weight of a collapsing skyscraper. The existence of a 3-year-old child meant Wyatt was actively sleeping with Camille and starting a hidden family precisely when he told Sylvia he was deeply mourning his comatose wife. Sylvia physically staggered backward, gripping the edge of the acrylic podium to keep from collapsing onto the wooden stage. Her mind aggressively processed the sickening truth about her lavish high society lifestyle. She realized with profound, absolute horror that her sprawling, multi-million-dollar stone mansion in Austin, her imported luxury vehicles, her exclusive day spa treatments, and her expensive weekly caviar dinners were all paid for with highly illegal stolen money. Every single luxury she enjoyed was built directly on top of the massive financial exploitation of the black woman standing proudly before her and the actively drained pension of an aging black engineer. The philanthropic foundation she had proudly championed to her elite friends was not a noble charity saving lives. It was a literal blood bank designed to siphon minority wealth to subsidize her unearned white upper-class privilege. The deep, sickening revulsion set firmly into her bones. Her elite high society status was instantly transformed into a massive, highly radioactive criminal liability. She looked at the expensive designer gown she was wearing and suddenly felt like she was covered in physical dirt. She realized she was not a respected local philanthropist married to a brilliant tech visionary. She was just another gullible mark actively funding her own illusion through the profound suffering of innocent people. Wyatt saw the absolute unadulterated disgust washing over Sylvia's face. He recognized the exact moment his carefully constructed domestic illusion permanently shattered. He reached out with both hands, trying to grab her bare shoulders to pull her back into his web of strict psychological control. He begged her to listen to him, claiming he did it all to give her the beautiful, pristine life she truly deserved. Sylvia did not retreat from his grasp. She planted her feet firmly on the stage, reared her right arm back, and delivered a devastating, bone-rattling slap directly across Wyatt's face. The sheer, violent impact echoed loudly through the live microphone, ringing clearly in the ears of every single person in the massive ballroom. Wyatt's head snapped hard to the side, a bright red handprint instantly forming on his pale, sweating cheek. He stumbled backward, completely stunned by the physical blow. Sylvia did not stop there. She aggressively yanked the massive 5-carat diamond engagement ring off her finger. She hurled the heavy, expensive jewel directly at his chest, striking him hard against his sternum before it clattered uselessly onto the wooden floorboards. She turned away from him and faced the stunned audience, looking directly at Jackson and the hotel security personnel standing near the exits. She raised her voice to a furious, piercing scream and completely burned Wyatt's final hidden escape boat to the ground. She explicitly shouted out the exact routing number and the complex login credentials to a highly classified offshore cryptocurrency account located in the Cayman Islands. She told the entire room that Wyatt had forced her to memorize the sequence for a sudden emergency extraction in case his startup ever faced severe litigation. She handed the federal government the exact location of his final hidden cash reserve, effectively freezing his very last stolen dime. Wyatt fell to his knees on the wooden stage, completely and utterly destroyed. Wyatt remained on his knees on the polished wooden stage, staring blankly at the heavy diamond ring Sylvia had hurled at his chest. The entire grand ballroom was a swirling vortex of absolute chaos and profound elite outrage. The wealthy donors were still shouting furiously, demanding their money back and calling for immediate police intervention. Wyatt suddenly snapped out of his paralyzed state of shock. He looked at the furious crowd moving toward the stage and realized his entire meticulously constructed world had completely evaporated. The false aristocratic persona was gone. The fake charity was exposed. His offshore escape fund had just been loudly broadcast to a room full of people holding active cell phones. The primal instinct of a cornered, terrified animal finally took over his brain. He scrambled wildly to his feet, his rented black tuxedo completely disheveled and stained with his own sweat. He looked wildly around the massive room, assessing the tightening perimeter. He knew he could not simply walk out the front lobby doors where the hotel staff and the valet were already alerting the local authorities. He locked his desperate eyes on the heavy red emergency exit doors located at the far left side of the expansive ballroom. He lunged off the side of the wooden stage and began sprinting blindly through the maze of silk-draped tables. He shoved wealthy tech billionaires and elite socialites violently out of his path, knocking over expensive floral centerpieces and shattering crystal champagne flutes across the marble floor. 2 large hotel security guards moved quickly to intercept his path, stepping in front of the emergency exit. But Wyatt was running on the absolute sheer terror of a man facing decades in a federal penitentiary. He did not slow down. He lowered his shoulder and slammed his entire body weight directly into the first security guard. The unexpected violent impact sent the guard crashing backwards into a catering table, sending silver trays of expensive appetizers clattering to the floor. Wyatt threw a desperate, wild punch at the second guard, striking him awkwardly in the jaw. It was a sloppy, uncoordinated strike, but it created just enough physical space for Wyatt to slip past the defensive line. He threw his entire body against the heavy metal crash bar of the emergency exit door. He was absolutely convinced that if he could just get out into the dark, rainy alleyway behind the hotel, he could disappear into the dense Austin night and figure out a way to survive. He pushed the heavy steel door outward with a massive, desperate shove. The door swung open violently, but Wyatt did not run out into an empty, dark alleyway. He ran directly into a solid, impenetrable wall of federal law enforcement. Standing perfectly still just outside the threshold under the harsh glare of the exterior security lights was Maxwell Reed. My ruthless corporate attorney was immaculately dressed in a dark tailored suit, holding a sleek leather briefcase, calmly shielding himself from the rain with a large black umbrella. He looked down at Wyatt with an expression of absolute freezing disgust, as if he were inspecting a squashed cockroach on the bottom of his expensive leather shoe. Flanking Maxwell on both sides were 4 heavily armed federal agents. They were wearing thick tactical vests with the letters FBI emblazoned across their chests in bright, glaring yellow. They stood with absolute rigid military discipline, blocking any possible avenue of physical escape. Wyatt froze completely, his eyes darting frantically between the armed federal agents and the cold, calculating face of the attorney who had orchestrated his absolute destruction. He tried to quickly backpedal into the ballroom, but it was entirely too late. The lead federal agent stepped forward with terrifying speed and grabbed Wyatt roughly by the collar of his expensive tuxedo jacket. He spun the fraudulent tech billionaire around and slammed him face first against the cold, wet brick wall of the hotel exterior. To understand exactly how Maxwell Reed managed to secure a highly coordinated tactical FBI raid at a high society charity gala, you have to understand the profound depth of Wyatt's earlier financial miscalculations. Wyatt genuinely believed his biggest immediate problem was the temporary federal asset freeze Maxwell had initiated regarding the fake charity funds. He failed to comprehend the massive radioactive fallout of his actions in the Austin warehouse district just a few nights prior. When Wyatt used the fraudulent transfer on death deed containing my intentionally voided signature to secure a $2 million illegal cash loan, he thought he was simply dealing with local loan sharks. He did not know that the specific criminal syndicate he borrowed from had been the primary target of a massive ongoing federal racketeering and money laundering investigation for over 3 years. The FBI had every single prominent member of that underground organization under constant, intense digital and physical surveillance. The exact second Wyatt walked into that dimly lit warehouse club and handed the syndicate bosses a forged property deed connecting a clean civilian asset to their dirty money, he unwittingly dragged his entire domestic fraud operation directly onto the absolute center of the federal radar. He merged his localized elder abuse scam with a massive international organized crime syndicate. The FBI immediately flagged his identity and began quietly investigating his entire financial history. They instantly discovered the massive discrepancies in the Camille Hope Foundation, the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, and the steady stream of stolen pension funds crossing state lines. Maxwell did not have to beg the federal government to intervene in a messy family dispute. He simply handed the lead FBI investigators the final missing puzzle pieces they needed to secure their massive racketeering indictments. He provided them with the verified forensic proof of the forged signature and the audio recordings of Wyatt explicitly detailing his financial crimes. The federal agents had been quietly waiting in the shadows of the hotel alleyway all night, simply waiting for the optimal, highly public moment to execute the primary arrest warrants and secure the digital assets Sylvia had conveniently screamed out to the entire room. Wyatt had literally handed himself over to the federal government wrapped in a neat, highly predictable package of arrogant desperation. The lead federal agent pressed his forearm firmly against the back of Wyatt's neck, holding him completely immobilized against the wet brick wall. The sharp, cold, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking tightly around Wyatt's wrists echoed loudly through the open emergency doorway, cutting sharply through the chaotic noise of the ballroom. It was the absolute, final, definitive sound of structural failure. The agent pulled Wyatt away from the wall and forcefully turned him around to face the bright lights of the ballroom interior. Wyatt was panting heavily, his perfectly styled blonde hair plastered to his forehead with rain and cold sweat. The dark theatrical makeup he had used to cover his facial bruises was running down his cheeks in dirty streaks, making him look completely pathetic and totally unhinged. The federal agent spoke with a loud, booming voice that commanded the absolute attention of everyone standing near the exit. He officially read Wyatt his Miranda rights and explicitly listed the massive federal charges against him. The agent charged him with multiple counts of aggravated international wire fraud. He charged him with massive corporate money laundering. He charged him with severe criminal identity theft and federal elder financial exploitation. Every single word was a heavy, physical blow, driving Wyatt further and further into the ground. The sheer, overwhelming weight of the federal charges completely broke Wyatt's fragile psychological spine. His legs simply gave out beneath him. He collapsed heavily onto the hard marble floor just inside the doorway, dragging the 2 federal agents down slightly as they struggled to keep him upright. He fell to his knees, his hands bound tightly behind his back, his expensive rented tuxedo completely ruined. He looked up past the armed agents and locked his desperate, terrified eyes directly onto me. I had walked slowly down from the stage and was standing just a few feet away, leaning calmly on my heavy oak walking cane, watching the tactical extraction of the parasite. Wyatt completely abandoned his polished, elite persona. He started sobbing hysterically, the sound ripping through his chest in pathetic, ragged gasps. He crawled forward on his knees, ignoring the agents pulling at his shoulders. He looked up at me with a face completely contorted by pure, absolute terror. He screamed my name, begging me for mercy. He cried out that we were family, that he had simply made some terrible financial mistakes under immense startup pressure. He pleaded with me to tell the armed federal agents that this was all just a massive administrative misunderstanding. He begged me to save his life, promising to return every single penny he had ever taken. He wailed like a broken, frightened child, demanding that the man he had ruthlessly exploited for 5 years suddenly step forward and shield him from the brutal, devastating consequences of his own monstrous actions. I looked down at the weeping, broken man kneeling in the spilled champagne and broken glass. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel a shred of sorrow. I felt the profound, cold satisfaction of an engineer watching a condemned, toxic building successfully, completely, and safely imploded. Wyatt's desperate pleas echoed off the high-vaulted ceiling of the grand ballroom, but they were met with an absolute suffocating silence. The hundreds of wealthy guests who just moments ago were eagerly writing him massive checks now stood frozen like marble statues. Nobody moved, nobody whispered. The string quartet had long since packed their instruments and fled. The only sounds remaining were the heavy, ragged gasps of a broken predator and the rhythmic, authoritative tapping of my oak walking cane as I stepped closer. I stopped exactly 2 feet away from him. I stood towering over his kneeling, trembling form. The harsh glare of the security lights from the emergency exit cast long, distorted shadows across the wet marble floor. Wyatt looked up at me, his eyes wide and completely bloodshot. His expensive tuxedo was smeared with mud from his failed escape and soaked in his own terrified sweat. He looked absolutely pathetic, stripped of every single layer of his manufactured corporate armor. The elite audience watched in total fascination, held captive by the raw, undeniable spectacle of absolute justice. I did not raise my hand to strike him. I did not need to. The sheer overwhelming weight of my physical presence was enough to press him further into the dirt. I stood there, a silent monolith of righteous fury, letting the unbearable quiet of the room crush whatever remaining shred of dignity he desperately clung to. The silence was not empty. It was heavily loaded with the catastrophic consequences of his own making. The crushing silence finally broke Wyatt's fragile mind entirely. He began to babble a frantic, incoherent stream of pathetic justifications and cowardly excuses. He spat out his words rapidly, his voice cracking under the intense scrutiny of the federal agents and the wealthy elite. He told me I simply did not understand the immense, suffocating pressure of his world. He claimed the tech industry in Austin was a ruthless, unforgiving meat grinder that demanded immediate, massive success or absolute failure. He wept, insisting that he never actually wanted to hurt Camille. He spun a sickening, desperate narrative claiming he only orchestrated the medical fraud because he needed rapid seed capital to build a massive empire. He looked at Camille, who was standing a few feet behind me, completely unbothered by his tears, and screamed that he did it all for her. He claimed he wanted to give her the absolute best life imaginable, a life of supreme luxury and total security that a standard 9-to-5 job could never provide. He blamed the relentless expectations of high society. He blamed the aggressive venture capitalists who demanded astronomical returns. He even blamed the inherent economic disparities of the country, acting as if his massive, calculated fraud was just a necessary, tragic byproduct of aggressive modern capitalism. He pleaded that he just wanted to be worthy of my daughter to be the wealthy, powerful provider she fundamentally deserved. He twisted his horrific systematic abuse into a twisted love story, trying to convince the federal agents holding his chains that he was just a highly ambitious man who made a few regrettable administrative errors under extreme emotional duress. He begged me to look at his intentions rather than his actions. He swore that if I just called off the FBI and unfroze his accounts, he would build a legitimate empire and pay me back tenfold. His entire defense was a masterclass in narcissistic delusion. He completely refused to take an ounce of genuine accountability. He was actively trying to gaslight a room full of federal agents, a crowd of furious billionaires, and the very father whose life savings he had systematically drained. He thought he could simply talk his way out of a federal indictment using the exact same manipulative corporate buzzwords he used to secure his initial illicit funding. I listened to his pathetic rationalizations without a single change in my facial expression. His desperate attempts to reframe his sociopathic greed as romantic ambition were deeply insulting to human intelligence. He genuinely believed that his desire for unearned wealth somehow justified burying his legal wife alive in a fake medical coma. He expected the world to absolve him of his monstrous crimes simply because he felt the innate, entitled urge to be rich. I slowly reached down and firmly gripped the heavy brass handle of my walking cane with my right hand. The bright stage lights illuminated the deep, permanent scars crisscrossing my dark knuckles. My hands are not smooth or manicured. They are heavily calloused, thick and rough like aged leather. They are the undeniable physical receipt of 40 years spent hauling steel reinforcements, pouring concrete foundations, and meticulously drafting structural blueprints late into the night. I spent my entire adult life building things that were specifically designed to endure massive external pressure and stand the test of time. I earned every single dollar of my pension through grueling, honest physical and mental labor. I sacrificed my own bodily comfort to ensure my daughter would never have to experience the bitter sting of poverty. I looked down at Wyatt's hands, which were currently bound tightly together by heavy federal steel cuffs. His hands were perfectly smooth, pale, and entirely devoid of a single day of hard labor. They were soft, pampered hands that had never lifted anything heavier than a crystal champagne flute or a premium silver fountain pen. He used those pristine, manicured fingers to forge medical directives, authorize illegal wire transfers, and sign fraudulent real estate deeds. He utilized his inherent societal privilege and his unblemished physical presentation to bypass the grueling, honest work required to build genuine wealth. He looked at my scarred, calloused hands with deep underlying disgust, for years silently judging my working-class roots while actively funding his elite lifestyle with my hard-earned money. He thought his soft, white hands were inherently destined to hold millions regardless of who he had to crush to get it. He viewed honest labor as a humiliating punishment reserved for the lower classes. He fundamentally believed his polished corporate aesthetic gave him the divine right to bypass the foundation and jump straight to the penthouse. He built nothing of value in his entire miserable life. He simply acted as an elegant, highly destructive termite gnawing away at the sturdy, resilient structures built by the sheer sweat and blood of much better, stronger people. He never understood the profound, quiet dignity of earning a living. He only understood the frantic, parasitic rush of stealing one. His soft hands were custom-built for taking, never for making, and now those same pristine hands were permanently locked behind his back, stained with dirt and his own dried blood. I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored black tuxedo vest. My thick fingers brushed against a small, folded piece of paper I had carried with me ever since I boarded the flight from Texas. I slowly pulled it out and unfolded it under the harsh glare of the security lights. It was not a legal brief or a bank statement. It was the very first wire transfer receipt I had ever sent him. Exactly $1,000 dated 5 years ago, the month he falsely claimed my daughter was locked in a vegetative coma. I held it out, letting the crisp white paper catch the light. Wyatt stopped his frantic sobbing and stared blankly at the small document. I opened my fingers and let the piece of paper flutter downward. It drifted slowly through the tense air and landed squarely on his tear-stained cheek, sticking slightly to his sweating skin before falling to the marble floor. I leaned in close, ensuring my voice was a low, devastating rumble that only he and the federal agents could hear. "You did not crave success, Wyatt. You craved blood. You are nothing but a parasite. That receipt did not buy my daughter's life, but it is the exact official death warrant for yours." Exactly 6 months after the dramatic federal raid at the Austin Hotel, the wheels of justice finally ground to a halt inside a federal courthouse in downtown Dallas. The 6 months leading up to this exact day were a period of intense legal preparation and absolute silent observation. I walked through the heavy mahogany doors of the courtroom with my daughter Camille holding my right arm. We did not walk with our heads bowed in shame or exhaustion. We walked with the absolute rigid posture of victors arriving to claim our final hard-earned prize. We took our seats in the very first row of the gallery directly behind the prosecution tables. We were close enough to smell the acrid fear sweating out of Wyatt. We were close enough to see the deep, permanent sweat stains on the collar of his cheap, poorly fitting gray suit. He was sitting at the defense table looking like a hollowed-out shell of the arrogant tech billionaire he once pretended to be. The grand federal courtroom was a cold, intimidating structure built of solid marble and dark, polished wood. It was a physical environment designed specifically to strip away human hubris and crush fraudulent egos under the immense weight of the law. As an engineer, I appreciated the architecture of the room. It was built to contain explosive emotional pressure and enforce absolute rigid order. I set my heavy oak walking cane down against the wooden pew. Camille sat perfectly still beside me wearing a sharp-tailored navy blazer. Her spine was perfectly straight. She did not shed a single tear. She was completely immunized against his desperate manipulations. The trial we were about to witness was not a debate. It was an absolute, heavily choreographed legal execution. The federal prosecutor stood before the judge and systematically began dropping massive concrete boulders of undeniable evidence onto the pathetic defense Wyatt's overworked public defender attempted to build. Wyatt could not afford a high-priced corporate legal team because every single asset he touched was still locked tightly behind federal freezing orders. His public defender tried weakly to argue that the entire situation was a complex domestic misunderstanding and a series of tragic bookkeeping errors caused by immense startup pressure. That fragile, paper-thin defense collapsed instantly under the sheer overwhelming volume of the digital paper trail Maxwell, Reed, and Jackson had meticulously provided to the government. The prosecutor projected the forged medical power of attorney on the massive courtroom monitors, pointing out the exact forensic discrepancies in the signature line. He played the crystal-clear audio recordings of Wyatt explicitly threatening to pull the plug on his own breathing wife. The sound of his vicious, predatory voice echoing through the federal courtroom made the jury physically recoil in sheer disgust. The prosecutor then paraded the hired actress who played my comatose daughter across the witness stand. She tearfully confessed to accepting thousands of dollars in stolen pension funds to lay perfectly still in that fake Seattle medical room while wearing heavy bandages. Every single lie Wyatt ever told was surgically dissected and permanently destroyed in the public record. But the most terrifying presence in that courtroom did not belong to the federal prosecutors or the stern federal judge. I glanced casually over my right shoulder toward the very back rows of the gallery. Sitting quietly in the deep shadows were three men wearing sharp, dark-tailored suits. They were not local reporters covering a high-profile fraud case. They were not curious law students observing federal procedure. They were high-ranking enforcers for the dangerous Austin criminal syndicate. They sat perfectly still with their hands folded in their laps, staring massive invisible holes directly into the back of Wyatt's skull. They had come to personally witness the fate of the man who had arrogantly defrauded their highly violent illicit organization out of $2 million. Wyatt refused to look back at them. He kept his eyes firmly glued to the defense table, his hands shaking violently as he scribbled useless notes on a yellow legal pad. He knew absolutely that a federal prison sentence was the only thing standing between him and a shallow, unmarked grave in the barren Texas desert. The law was paradoxically the only physical shield he had left against the absolute monsters he had foolishly invited into his life. He had built his entire house out of highly flammable materials, and now he was completely surrounded by men holding lit matches. The profound physical and psychological degradation of Wyatt over the past 6 months was staggering to witness from the front row. He had spent half a decade strictly controlling the narrative surrounding his life, maintaining a pristine, glossy exterior while the interior foundation rotted away. Now the facade was entirely gone. He had lost absolutely everything he ever valued in the blink of an eye. The morning after the hotel raid, Sylvia had immediately filed for an aggressive, expedited divorce. She possessed zero loyalty to a man whose entire fortune was built on massive federal crimes. She fully cooperated with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, handing over every single digital password and offshore account routing number to completely shield herself from any lingering criminal liability. She legally changed her last name, packed up her 2 teenage children, and moved entirely out of the state to escape the massive radioactive fallout of his public humiliation. She left him to face the federal government completely alone. The multi-million-dollar stone mansion in Austin was aggressively foreclosed upon and seized by the federal government to begin the long restitution process. His imported luxury sports cars were impounded and auctioned off by the state. His elite country club memberships were permanently revoked. His wealthy venture capitalist friends completely abandoned him, instantly erasing his phone number and pretending they never even knew his name. He was left with absolutely nothing but the cheap standard-issue suit on his back and the terrifying reality of his mounting federal indictments. He sat at the defense table, constantly picking at his cuticles, a broken, pathetic man who had actively engineered his own total isolation. He had built his entire identity on the systematic theft of my daughter's independence and my financial stability. Without our resources to artificially inflate his massive ego, he immediately shrunk back into the weak, cowardly fraud he fundamentally always was. He had no secondary family left to manipulate. He had no stolen money left to launder. He had no elite social circles left to impress with his fake tech jargon. He was a parasite completely separated from its host, rapidly withering away under the harsh, unforgiving light of absolute truth. He looked at Camille and me one last time with hollow, dead eyes, realizing that the people he viewed as weak stepping stones had ultimately become the massive concrete walls of his permanent prison. The federal judge, a stern, gray-haired man with zero tolerance for financial predators, adjusted his reading glasses and looked down from his elevated wooden bench. He did not mince his words or offer any shallow judicial sympathy. He looked directly at Wyatt and called his crimes a calculated, sickening display of profound moral bankruptcy. The judge stated that weaponizing the healthcare system and exploiting the sacred bond between a father and his daughter was a predatory act that demanded the absolute harshest punishment available. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down onto the sounding block with a sharp, deafening crack that echoed like a fatal gunshot through the silent marble courtroom. The judge handed down the absolute maximum penalty allowed under the strict federal sentencing guidelines: 15 years in a high-security federal penitentiary. Absolutely no possibility of early parole. The judge also ordered full mandatory financial restitution totaling exactly $460,000 to be repaid directly to my daughter and me upon his eventual highly unlikely release. Wyatt let out a sudden, guttural scream of pure absolute despair. His knees buckled completely as two massive United States Marshals grabbed him firmly by the arms and hauled him forcefully out from behind the defense table. He thrashed wildly against their iron grip, crying out incoherently as they dragged him backward toward the heavy steel holding cell doors. He wailed into the empty courtroom, his mind finally shattering completely under the immense crushing weight of his absolute failure. The heavy metal doors slammed shut behind him, permanently severing him from the free world. I looked at Camille and she looked back at me. We did not smile. We simply stood up together, completely unburdened, and walked quietly out of the courtroom into the bright, warm Texas sun. Stepping out of the heavy double doors of the federal courthouse, the bright Texas sun temporarily blinded me. The oppressive, sterile air of the judicial building was instantly replaced by a warm, sweeping southern breeze. I stood at the top of the wide concrete steps and took my first genuine deep breath in 5 long years. The heavy, crushing weight that had been permanently resting on my chest was completely and totally gone. Camille stood right beside me, holding my left arm tightly. She tilted her head back and closed her eyes, letting the raw, natural sunlight wash over her face. We did not look back at the building behind us. There was absolutely nothing left for us inside those walls. The man who had stolen half a decade of our lives was now officially a federal inmate designated by a numbered uniform in the maximum security penitentiary system. His grand illusions were completely buried under a massive mountain of irrefutable forensic evidence and 15 years of hard, unyielding time. We walked down the steps toward the waiting car, moving with the steady, synchronized rhythm of two people who had successfully navigated a highly treacherous minefield. The dark past was permanently sealed in a vault of legal records and criminal transcripts. We were no longer victims of a complex domestic illusion. We were the absolute architects of our own total liberation. The sky above Dallas was a pristine, brilliant blue, completely clear of any lingering dark storm clouds. The devastating hurricane was finally over. The long, grueling process of clearing the toxic debris and laying a fresh, solid foundation could officially begin today. I did not let Camille return to that lonely, isolated house in Seattle to pack her things. I hired a specialized commercial moving company to box up her essential belongings and ship them directly to my home in Texas. That same afternoon, we boarded a direct flight to Austin, leaving the bitter, rainy memories of the Pacific Northwest far behind us. My modest brick house in the working-class neighborhood transformed overnight. For 5 long years, it had been a silent, hollow museum dedicated to a daughter I thought I had permanently lost to a tragic physical accident. Now the hallways echoed with the energetic, chaotic footsteps of a healthy, vibrant 3-year-old boy. My grandson brought an explosive, profound life back into the rooms that had been suffocated by manufactured grief. I spent my mornings cooking massive breakfasts of eggs and grits, watching Camille laugh out loud as her son chased the neighborhood's stray cats through the backyard. The dark, heavy circles under her eyes completely vanished, replaced by a bright, resilient spark of genuine happiness. 2 months after the trial concluded, Maxwell Reed called me with a highly anticipated update from the federal authorities. The FBI Financial Task Force had successfully untangled the massive complex web of Wyatt's offshore shell companies and illegal cryptocurrency transfers. They seized the stolen assets, processed the mandatory legal restitutions, and officially wired the recovered funds back to their rightful owner. Camille's maternal trust fund was fully restored to its original balance of over $400,000, down to the exact final cent. Furthermore, the federal court ordered the complete liquidation of Wyatt's remaining legal equity in the Austin mansion, transferring the resulting capital directly to me as aggressive compensation for the $60,000 in pension funds he had systematically extorted. The financial parasite had been completely eradicated, and the host was fully replenished. I watched my daughter log into her secure banking portal on my study computer. She stared at the glowing green numbers on the screen, verifying her fully restored independence. She did not cry. She simply nodded a firm, resolute acknowledgement of a hard-fought structural victory. She was no longer financially bound to a predator. She was completely free to build her own life on her own terms, on a foundation composed of solid concrete rather than fragile, manipulative lies. The true measure of a structure is not how it stands on a calm, sunny day, but how it completely rebuilds itself after experiencing a devastating seismic earthquake. Camille did not just recover from the intense psychological abuse Wyatt inflicted upon her. She fundamentally transformed the deep trauma into a powerful, hardened weapon. During the years she was trapped in that Seattle suburb, Wyatt had aggressively conditioned her to believe she was intellectually incompetent and fundamentally incapable of managing basic logistics. He convinced her she was a fragile medical liability who needed his absolute control to survive the real world. But living in Texas and actively participating in the ruthless legal dismantling of his empire fundamentally rewired her entire psychological framework. She realized she possessed an innate analytical brilliance she had simply allowed him to suppress. Armed with her fully restored trust fund, she did not retreat into a life of quiet luxury or fearful isolation. She utilized her harrowing personal experience to become a highly effective shield for others facing the exact same terror. Camille accepted a full-time position as a senior advocate at a prestigious nonprofit organization in Dallas, dedicated entirely to assisting victims of complex financial fraud and elder abuse. She sat in brightly lit conference rooms looking terrified, desperate victims directly in the eyes, and showing them exactly how to systematically trace hidden assets and legally obliterate their abusers. She worked closely with forensic accountants and federal investigators, using the exact same aggressive digital tracking methods Jackson had taught us during our hunt for Wyatt. She became a relentless, terrifying force against domestic financial predators. She understood their exact operational playbooks, their specific manipulative scripts, and their inherent psychological weaknesses better than any textbook lawyer ever could. Watching her leave for work every morning wearing sharp professional suits and carrying thick legal dossiers filled me with an overwhelming sense of profound paternal pride. She was no longer the vulnerable girl who blindly signed a deceptive power of attorney in a sterile hospital bed. She was a fully realized independent warrior actively hunting down men who operated exactly like her ex-husband. She had taken the absolute worst experience of her life and forged it into an unbreakable steel armor protecting the innocent from the wicked. The late afternoon Texas sun cast long, warm shadows across my front porch. I sat in my favorite wooden rocking chair holding a set of complex magnetic engineering blocks. My 3-year-old grandson sat cross-legged on the wooden floorboards right next to my boots, concentrating fiercely. I patiently guided his small hands, showing him exactly how to align the load-bearing joints to build a miniature suspension bridge that would not collapse under sudden pressure. We were building a proper foundation together. My secure cell phone buzzed sharply on the small patio table. It was Maxwell Reed. He spoke with his usual crisp, professional efficiency. He informed me that the federal bankruptcy court had officially located and liquidated Wyatt's absolute final hidden asset. It was a minor, obscure stock portfolio he had desperately tried to conceal under a fake corporate alias right before his arrest. The federal judge had aggressively seized the funds and transferred the entire remaining balance of $80,000 directly into a locked high-yield educational trust fund strictly in my grandson's name. Wyatt had essentially been forced by the federal government to fully finance the future college education of the child he had selfishly tried to weaponize and abandon. I thanked Maxwell for his exceptional work and ended the call. I picked up my ceramic mug and took a slow, deliberate sip of hot black coffee. I looked up toward the street and saw Camille walking up the driveway, returning home from a long, successful day at the Advocacy Center. She carried her briefcase in one hand and waved to her son with the other. She caught my eye and flashed a bright, genuine smile full of absolute peace. I smiled back, letting the profound, quiet victory settle deeply into my aging bones. The silent adjustment was complete. It was brutal. It was perfectly precise. And it was absolutely irreversible. Looking back on this entire ordeal, I learned a profound lesson about the true nature of power. True power does not announce itself with loud threats, flashy cars, or expensive tailored suits. It does not rely on arrogant assumptions or the cruel exploitation of vulnerable people. True power is perfectly silent and intensely patient. It is the ability to observe a deeply corrupted system, identify its weakest structural points, and dismantle it with absolute precision. Predators survive by assuming good people are fundamentally weak. They fail to realize that a quiet parent armed with the absolute truth is the most destructive force on Earth. If you enjoyed watching a ruthless predator get systematically dismantled by the very family he underestimated, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below.